Okay, welcome everybody to the Committee for Infrastructure. I'm just going to provide a brief overview of today's business. The committee will consider oral evidence from the Department for Infrastructure on the revised SL1s to implement the Reservoirs Act Northern Ireland 2015. We're going to consider oral evidence from the Northern Ireland Audit Office on their report on funding water infrastructure in Northern Ireland. Receive an oral briefing from Assembly's Research and Information Service decarbonising transport, policy approaches of the UK regions and Republic of Ireland. Consider one statutory rule subject to Assembly procedure, and consider one proposal for a statutory rule and one statutory rule not subject to Assembly procedure. So we're just going to proceed through the agenda as follows. So apologies, I don't have any, but I have Nicola Brogan and Mark Durkin joining us online today. Declarations of interest are remind members that they are obliged to declare any relevant or financial or other interests which might reasonably be thought by others to influence their approach to the matter under consideration. Any members who have interest to declare in relation to today's business should do so now or when the particular matter arises in the meeting. So does any members have any interest that they wish to declare at this stage? No? Okay, thank you. Item 3 is Chairperson's business. At page 69 you'll see that there is an invitation for myself to join as Chair and the Board of the Utility Regulator for a dinner on the evening of the 21st of May to discuss water and sewage issues, to which the Chairperson of the Economy Committee has also been invited. So I'm just seeking agreement that the committee is content for myself to attend the event on the committee's behalf. Okay, thank you. Item 4 is draft minutes. At page 7 you see draft minutes of the proceedings of the meeting on the 26th of March 2025. So I'm just seeking agreement that members are content that the minutes are a true and accurate reflection of the meeting on the 26th of March 2025. If so, I'll sign the minutes now. Good. Content? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, item 5 is matters arising. So I'm asking members if they have any matters arising from the previous meeting. No. Okay. Item 6 is correspondence. At page 20 you'll see the correspondence memo. At page 32 you'll see response from the Minister to the committee request for a further evidence session with the Minister. Members will recall that during an oral evidence session on the 26th of February, the Minister committed to checking her availability with a view to scheduling a further oral evidence session earlier than June. So I just want to seek members' views on that. Obviously the Minister has said that she's willing to come back to the committee in June. I think it's important that we do take up the opportunity from the Minister, and hopefully at that stage we will have some more detail around what's happening, DVA, other issues as well. So do members have any comments they want to make? Keith?
Yeah, so Chair, are we then requesting that the Minister comes in June? I know she's available, but are we requesting that she comes in?
Yeah, so I'm suggesting that the committee does secure a further session with the Minister in June, and that obviously the clerks will engage with the department to explore the options for a further session later with the Minister after summer recess. And to be honest, I want it stipulated that we do want adequate time with the Minister. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for 90 minutes with the Minister, considering the amount of pressures that are happening within the department and the amount of issues that we're looking at as a committee. So are members content with that? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Okay, at page 35, copies of the department's the Driver and Vehicle Agency's Quarter 3 monitoring reports. It obviously states DFI's performance against 20 objectives specified in its business plans. 4 have been delayed status, namely the publication of the draft transport strategy, the review of major road projects prioritisation, further commencement of the Reservoirs Act, and publication of the regional strategic plan and policy on renewable and low carbon energy. The DVA's business plan highlights that of the 14 objectives outlined, 2 have red status, signifying that these will not be achieved. These relate to the trading fund financial target and the generation of a return on capital of 3.5%. So in the first instance, maybe members, we invite to highlight, members, I just want to maybe that we look at the issues contained in DVA's business plan, and in the absence of any issues, maybe we could seek out getting a briefing in relation to the MOT testing, and that we include the DVA business plan as a result of that as well during that briefing session. Are you content with that? Sorry, I wasn't very clear there. But what I'm looking at is during our MOT testing vehicle equipment, which we want to look at, we'll also include DVA's business plan. Are you content with that?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Is there any other things that members might want to raise in relation to DVA and the business plan there? No, you're happy enough. Okay, page 48, a committee invitation to a roundtable event on planning. So obviously we all received an invitation from the department last Wednesday to participate in a roundtable discussion aimed at improving the planning system. That was a very short notice to the committee, and the event is coinciding with the committee happening today. So the committee hasn't had an opportunity to consider this until today, which I think is poor, to be honest. And understand that these events are part of the department's 7 foundations, the first of which looks at planning. So the event today will be the only one covering planning. However, the committee will be invited to attend the future sessions on the other foundation areas. So, members, I'm of the view that the committee writes to the department to request a list of the stakeholders that were involved today, who are in attendance at the event, and seek an overview of the key themes and the proposed solutions that were raised today at the roundtable. Are members content with that? Or is there any comments anybody wants to make, Keith?
Yeah, Chair, it's just interesting that we get the invite at 4:10 after our constructive planning session. Mm-hmm. So it says a lot to me that session forced that invite.
Yeah.
Could be wrong, but that's what it looks like.
Yeah, it does feel like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, Chair. I mean, it's part of our work, and I mean, it's pity it clashes with today. I mean, they seriously have to have a conversation about when these take place.
Yeah.
I mean, people know when plenty's on, they know when committee's on now. If it clashes with another committee, 100%, but they certainly know the DFI meets on a Wednesday morning and can run. So,
would you like, in terms of that correspondence that we're writing to the department, that we make that clear that that's the feeling of the committee, that we felt that, in a way, we felt that we were overlooked, given the time scale of when the correspondence came to the committee?
Overlooked? No, if that session hadn't happened, we wouldn't have got the invite.
So are you proposing then that we just include that?
I think in the future, Chair, some of us, especially yourself as the Vice Chair, should be invited, as part of our work and represent.
Yeah.
One way or not, I think that's the best way to approach it.
So
we don't all necessarily.
But as long as the committee, and if some of us can go, 100%. That should be reflected as opposed to.
So you would like us to then, as part of that correspondence, ascertain why the committee received the correspondence at such short notice? Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, that's reasonable, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And then obviously your agreement, just that we get this list of stakeholders and what actually came out of that that round table today. Okay, thank you. At page 52, you'll see correspondence from the Committee for Justice. I'm seeking agreement that any future items of correspondence on this matter will not be included in meeting packs unless any unrelated issues are highlighted by the clerk requiring the committee's consideration. You content?
Done.
Okay, thank you. At page 58, you'll see response from Northern Ireland Water on wastewater capacity issues. So just want to advise the committee that Northern Ireland Water have stated that they will not be able to address the transition to net zero position or plan for new sludge facilities when the current incinerators go beyond their expected viable life in 2032, 2033. That was something that, had been evidence to us in our evidence session with NI Water beforehand as well. So I'm just reminding members, following the oral evidence from Northern Ireland Water, the committee received correspondence from a journalist, member of the public, and from Friends of the Earth requesting a copy of the information sought on the disparity in the compliance rates for announced and unannounced sampling. The information is detailed under point 3 from Northern Ireland Water's response, pages 62 to 66 of the members' pack. So I'm just seeking your views or agreement in relation to whether members are content to provide the extract from point 3 of Northern Ireland Water's response to the member of the public and to Friends of the Earth. So solely that point 3, because obviously there's other information there that was to the committee. So are you content with that? Okay. Any other views in relation to that piece of correspondence? Okay. Sorry, Andrew.
Quite telling that the unannounced regimes and the targets, the numbers are quite telling there, that whenever it's announced, that they're correlate quite highly, and whenever they're unannounced, there's quite a disparity. So it's just, it is. Yeah, that is what it is on the table.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I suppose in ways that just shows how the importance of unannounced inspections as well. So yeah, it's something to bear in mind for our future sessions as well. And obviously you'll have seen Sorpe, the letter in relation to that as well. Okay, so moving on to page 67, it's a response from a member of the public to a copy of a response forwarded to the individual from TransLink regarding public transport to and from medical appointments. So I'm just seeking agreement to highlight the committee's advisory and scrutiny role and suggest that they may wish to highlight the issues raised with their relevant MLAs within their own constituency. Are you content? Okay, is any other members have any other items that they wish to raise on any other item contained in the correspondence? No? Sorry, Keith.
Yeah, just Chair, remember the query we had on the 7.5 tonne weight restriction issue, page 33. I'm going back to it here. You see in the second paragraph down, just for clarity, does that mean, it says such as certain agricultural vehicles, does that mean any agricultural vehicles? Because you can have an agricultural vehicle under 7.5. So my question is, that centre paragraph or second paragraph states that there's an exemption for agriculture. Is that all agricultural vehicles? Because it doesn't say that, number one. And I'm not being picky.
Yeah. No, you're right.
The point is, why do it? It's an agricultural area, so anything above 7.5 tonne can go down the road. So what's the point of putting the weight restriction on?
Yeah. Do you want? We'll check that out just to make sure, because it is important. Just because it will have.
If you look down in paragraph,
locally.
Sorry, Chair. If you look down in paragraph 3, that indicates about timeline. It's about timescales due to consider budgetary pressures. So they're going to put a 7.5 weight restriction on this road forever. It's happening in my constituency. But I see on down there now the language has changed due to underfunding and austerity of the British government. I see now that it's changed from Tory government, so we're now to the British government austerity funding issues. And interestingly, 140,000 probably would solve that problem, but we'll leave that there, Chair. So I want just clarity on the 7.5 tonne, and can any agricultural vehicle above that weight, not certain, because that could be just the milk lorry going in instead of the guys spreading slurry. So I want clarity on that.
Clarity on the types of vehicles and
people think it's not a big thing. It's a massive issue to that road.
And
Well,
it
if you
is,
restrict vehicles and guys and ladies their business, it's a massive issue.
And do you want to check as well just around the timeline?
Well, it says that they're not going to put
I
a
know.
timeline on.
Yeah. But in terms
Want
of
to argue on the
review,
Tory British thing as well?
Oh, well, I think they've made it clear here.
No problem.
in terms of review,
Yeah, well,
you know, do you want to check in terms of do they review
Yes.
the roads as well? That's what I'm looking at in terms of any type of time scale there. So, you know, what review takes place on roads where there is those weight restrictions where they can maybe...
I presume it's a road issue, not a structure. I presume it's the road and not a structure. That's fine, I'll leave it at that.
All right, happy enough. Okay, thank you. Any other items of correspondence? No, okay. So I'm just seeking agreement then that members are content to note the remaining correspondence as contained in the correspondence memo in the meeting pack. Content? Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to item 7, which is the implementation of the Reservoirs Act Northern Ireland 2015 and consideration of revised SL1's Department for Infrastructure oral evidence. So at page 71 you'll see the Clark's memo. At pages 78 to 214 you'll see updated SL1's. At pages 215 to 248 you'll see the consultation report. And we welcome to the committee today Miss Alison Clydesdale, Director of Water and Drainage Policy, Department for Infrastructure, and Mr Ryan Robinson, Head of Flooding and Drainage Policy, Department for Infrastructure, and Hannah B as well. We are very welcome to the committee today. We appreciate your time in coming back to us, and we appreciate the fact that there is a bit more information now for the committee as well, which we are going to continue looking at because it is a very important matter. So, as per usual, I'm just going to ask that you make a brief opening statement for 5 minutes and then we'll come to members' questions. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Morning, Chair and members. Thank you for the invitation to provide further briefing to the committee this morning on the implementation of a legislative framework for reservoir safety in Northern Ireland. Thank you for the introductions. As you said, I'm joined here this morning by Ryan and Hannah, who are both from the Flooding and Drainage Policy team in my division, who are responsible for dealing with this legislation. So we're here this morning to discuss the secondary legislation that the Department is proposing to make to further commence the Reservoirs Act. This comprises of 2 sets of regulations and 3 orders, 2 of which are commencement orders. So I hope you find the additional information we provided helpful. As you're aware, in the absence of the Act being further commenced, the Department cannot regulate the safety of reservoir structures in Northern Ireland. A public safety risk therefore remains without the Act fully implemented, and consequently the Department is unable to provide sufficient assurance on the condition, management or maintenance of many reservoirs that would facilitate ongoing development in various commercially sensitive areas. This means that at this point the Department has no enforcement powers specific to reservoir structures. Once the Act is fully commenced, the Department as the enforcing authority then will have the power to intervene to ensure reservoir safety matters are addressed. Only a small number of sections of the Act commenced following Royal Assent in 2015, and therefore in the intervening period there has been no safety framework for reservoirs, and our colleagues in Rivers Directorate have been limited to reminding reservoir managers of their responsibilities under common law. This situation and the associated public safety risk will pertain until the Act is further commenced. While some reservoir managers have taken action to improve the safety of their reservoirs, unfortunately many have not, and therefore a public safety risk remains to those properties and people who live in the inundation zone of a reservoir in the event of a reservoir breach. So this secondary legislation will introduce a proportionate regulatory and management framework for controlled reservoirs in order to protect people, the environment, the economy and areas of cultural heritage from the risk of flooding due to an uncontrolled release of water from a reservoir. In its absence, a risk to life and property remains. The Act provides that a reservoir manager is responsible for reservoir safety and provides for a reservoir safety regime based on industry best practice and includes a 5-step process of registration, designation, supervision, inspection and a requirement to undertake measures in the interests of safety. Integral to the management framework is the supervision and inspection of reservoirs by specialist civil engineers known as reservoir panel engineers. When the Reservoirs Bill was passing through the Assembly in 2015, the Assembly at that time considered the threshold for a controlled reservoir and voted for the 10,000 cubic metres threshold, which is about 4 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Flood mapping at that time showed that the reservoirs of this size could endanger lives in the case of a breach. It should be noted then that Wales moved to a 10,000 cubic metre threshold in 2016, with England currently working to amend and update their legislation to include reservoirs of 10,000 cubic metres and above. Scotland also have provision in their Reservoir Scotland Act 2011 to move to 10,000 cubic metres, but this section has yet to be commenced in Scotland. Therefore, this legislation will bring Northern Ireland into line with other devolved administrations. Of the 176 controlled reservoirs in Northern Ireland known to the Department, approximately 68% are managed by a combination of Northern Ireland Water, local authorities and government departments, and 25% are in private ownership and 7% are managed by not-for-profit organisations. In the absence of the legislation, some reservoir managers are already voluntarily operating within the spirit of the Act, with the Department conferring on them responsible reservoir manager status. However, this is only an interim approach, and to reiterate, a public safety risk remains without the Act being fully implemented. The Department's proposals to further implement the Reservoir Acts were consulted on between November 21 and January 22, and the Department published its consultation response on the 27th of October 2022, just before the Assembly was devolved at that time. The consultation report was then subsequently provided to this committee in March 24 upon restoration of the Assembly. The main issues raised were included concerns regarding the costs associated with the introduction of the legislation and the potential for reservoirs being discontinued. In recognition of these concerns and that initial costs will be incurred for supervision and inspection by specialist engineers, this suite of legislation includes a permissive power for the Department to develop a grant scheme to help reservoir managers mitigate some of the costs of compliance. The grant scheme cannot be established until such times as the legislation giving the Department the powers to establish the grant scheme is in place. Northern Ireland is the only area in the British Isles where a grant scheme is being considered to assist reservoir managers meet their legal obligations. A draft consultation for the grant scheme for initial costs is currently being finalised for the Minister's consideration, and then a further consultation would be required in the future in respect of capital costs once inspections have been completed and further information is available on the scale and nature of the likely capital works required. Any grant scheme will of course be subject to business case approval and budget availability in future years. We have put 5 pieces of legislation before you today, and they are all intertwined and interconnected. And so by way of example, I thought it would be helpful if we just give you an example. So if we take the grant scheme, just to demonstrate the interconnection. So if we take the grant scheme, in order to give the Department the power to run the grant scheme, commencement order number 2 needs to be enacted. Before a grant can be provided, registration and designation is required. Both of these elements of the Act require commencement order number 1 to be commenced, and the Reservoirs Northern Ireland regulations then are also required to facilitate that registration process. In addition then, a reservoir manager will be required to appoint inspecting and supervising engineers from an agreed panel established by the Department. So this requires the Reservoirs Commissioning of Panel Engineers order to be commenced, and the Reservoirs Visits by Supervising Engineers regulations, notices and grants regulations which make provision for the supervising engineers' visits and the power to introduce the grant. So as you can see, all 5 pieces of the legislation are needed to facilitate those steps in order to bring forward not only the grant but the reservoir safety framework as well. So the Act, once fully commenced, will regulate the safety of controlled reservoirs to mitigate the possible flood risk, and without the Act fully implemented, a public safety risk remains to those properties and people who live in the inundation zones of a reservoir in the event of a reservoir breach. So we're happy to answer any questions you may have regarding the updated SL1s, but just as a reminder, you will appreciate that we may not be able to answer queries on individual reservoirs or reservoir managers if they fall under the National Protocol for Reservoir Information and Flood Maps, which provides guidance on the release of such information.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to kick off. Can you detail, obviously the Department's main aim is health and safety and ensuring that that's paramount. So since 2015, what health and safety concerns have there been? Has there been any incidences that have been reported in that 10-year period?
So responsibility for the Act only came to DFI in 2021, so I wouldn't have details before that. So it previously sat with the then DARD Rivers Directorate, came across as part of the organisation of the departments, I think, in 2016. But for some reason, the powers to around this didn't come. They just came to us in 2021.
So since 2021, has there been any incidences?
I would need to speak to our Rivers colleagues on that.
No, I would say I'm not aware of any incidences, but what I would say is the department have carried out some audits in that period, showing a number of reservoirs in a bit of a state of disrepair. So whilst we haven't had an incident, we know some reservoirs aren't in good condition.
Okay, and then during your evidence there, you said flood mapping at this time. So I'm taking it that was flood mapping of 2015 that has been used. As we know, flood maps are continually changed and assessed. So the flood maps, once this piece of legislation if and when this legislation comes to be, is that the 2015 flood maps that you have been using, and are those correct?
So that was a reference to the Assembly's decision-making process in 2015 at the time when they decided to bring in the 10,000 cubic metres threshold. So it's my understanding at the time, as the bill went through the Assembly, that those are the maps that would have been referred to then. The flood maps are part of the flood risk management plans, and they have been since updated and will be updated again with the next flood risk management plan. So there's a current flood risk management plan in place from 2021 to 2027 and a set of flood maps associated with those, which were published in 2021, I think. And then the flood risk management plan runs out in 27 and will be updated again, and there will be a process then in the third cycle of that to update the flood maps again. So the flood maps are updated quite a regular basis, taking into account climate change allowances, of course.
Okay. Given the caveat of budget availability, what analysis has the department undertaken to understand the financial impacts on reservoir managers of the commencement of the legislation?
As I said, we're currently preparing a consultation and a business case for a grant scheme for introducing inspection costs. So we've taken a look at those in terms of the average cost of inspection costs. I think we probably have some indication of those costs. Rand, do you have those costs?
Yeah, we think the total initial cost, which will include the appointment of a supervising engineer and an inspecting engineer, will come in somewhere between 5 and 10 grand, and that's from looking at local costs as well as the cost of engineers in GB.
And do you suspect that the grant scheme will actually help cover some of those costs for some of the reservoir managers?
We're bringing forward a grant scheme for the Minister's consideration. Our previous Minister made it clear his intention that he recognised the impacts of meeting the legislation, the compliance requirements, and we're looking at the costs for those who need it, and that's what will be in the consultation.
So what are the indicative costs arising from the analysis on low, medium and high consequence reservoirs? Is that...
Well, those costs will only be for medium and high. Low consequence reservoirs aren't subject to the same level of maintenance and regulations as the medium and high, and that's set out in the Act.
Okay. And how has the department engaged with reservoir managers to support them in understanding the implications arising from the rules on the reservoirs they are responsible for? Does that engagement happen pretty regularly? Are they aware in terms of the flood mapping and all of that will be used as a result?
So as part of the consultation process in late 21 and 22, there would have been engagement with reservoir managers at that time. More recently, we've had individual meetings with some of the reservoir managers and with others in that area.
Okay. Do you think that might be needed more at this moment in time to help them understand the implications of what's happening? Because there is a bit of a time there since 2021, and not everybody will have been engaged with since then, given, it's only the consultation.
I know our Rivers colleagues have worked quite extensively on a suite of guidance for reservoir managers as part of the incoming Act to assist them.
So what are the potential consequences, or has it been scoped out by the department, should a reservoir be abandoned or discontinued?
That was one of the issues that did come up in the consultation, and our Rivers colleagues are considering that. There is a requirement that there is a consequence, that is a potential consequence, yes.
Do you think that consequence will be higher, given that a grant scheme may not be in place to help facilitate some of these reservoir managers in a period of time?
There's certainly no evidence of that to date.
To date, yeah.
Yeah.
But it could be, through engagement with reservoir managers. Would that be a consideration that may be coming up with potential reservoir managers, that they may be in a difficult financial situation?
That has been recognised through the consultation, and as I say, that is why the previous minister and this minister made clear their intention to bring forward a consultation where reservoir managers will have the opportunity, obviously, to give us their views on that, but is bringing forward a consultation on providing grant support to help them meet their compliance under the Act.
So then in a case where a reservoir becomes abandoned or discontinued, and that may be as a result of the fact that, 5 to 10 grand is quite a lot for a reservoir manager, for an organisation, for a small local fishing club to take on, for example, who then would ultimately be responsible for safeguarding reservoirs should that occur?
Well, as I said, this is a legislative framework about reservoir safety. So the first step would be to ensure that reservoir was made safe. And our rivers colleagues, I would need to refer to them, but I believe the first step would be that the reservoir would be drawn down to ensure that it was safe.
So would that be the department taking complete responsibility of that reservoir?
There are no powers for the department to take on ownership of the reservoir under this legislation, but there are powers for the department to step in and make things safe.
So then, who then would be ultimately? I'm trying to understand just what the consequences of that would be. Who then would take ownership of that? Who would the department look to in that scenario? Given that there may be, I know that you've said there, the ultimate thing is to make sure that reservoir is safe, but the department's not taking any responsibility. Then after that, am I picking that up wrong? So where do DFI go after that?
As I said, the legislation sets out the rules around that. So if a reservoir is abandoned in that nature, the primary purpose of the legislation is to make sure that the reservoir is safe. The department, there are no powers in this for the department to take on ownership. The ownership remains with the reservoir owner or the reservoir manager, whoever's operating it, but the department does have powers to step in and make the reservoir safe. And there are a range of enforcement powers to ensure that the reservoirs are made safe.
Okay, so I just want to check, you talked about the nature of the 5 pieces of legislation being intertwined, and particularly in relation to the grant scheme, which I think, we can understand from that point of view. You're saying that they're intertwined. But what scope would there be to commence section 114 of the Act through a separate standalone statutory rule to allow the department to develop and gain approval for the business case for the grant scheme? Is it a requirement under the 2015 Act?
So the Act sets out the process required, and there is, I guess, a couple of prerequisites, I would call them, set out in the legislation before you would get to the grant scheme, in that reservoir managers must register their and that's set out in the legislation, the requirements for registration, because we need to know what reservoirs are out there and what size they are. So registration is required as a first step. Then Section 17 of the Act sets out the requirement for the department to make a designation, and that process then needs to happen. And that could be anywhere from 12 to 18 months. So reservoir managers are given 6 months to register, and then 12 to 18 months for the department to designate. And it's only at that point then, when they're registered and designated, that then they would be required to get an inspecting engineer in at that point, because you need the designation before the inspecting engineer comes in. Then the inspecting engineer will come in, and at that point then that's where the grant is coming in to pay for those costs for those inspecting engineers. So that would be the first point of cost, if you want, for a reservoir manager.
Okay, but we know that there is very strong support for the grant scheme, and that was detailed in the consultation as well. It's in the high 90% of people that are strongly in favour of the grant scheme. So would the department not even be open to considering commencing section 114, which is the grants, to allow reservoir managers and the Assembly to consider the proposed grant scheme prior to enacting the remaining provisions of the Act? Because I think that would give some level of comfort to the potential reservoir managers and some of these groups as well that are concerned about the extra cost that is going to be placed upon them.
So, as I said, the department is just commencing the legislation that was approved by the Assembly in 2015. and the Reservoirs Act sets out the process, which is registration and designation. So,
But we have this now, so we have the ability to look at this now, and that's why I'm asking whether the department, as in Department for Infrastructure, will look at this now in terms of how we can help, given that there is clear support for the grant scheme, and it will give that level of comfort as well, whether there is a process that can be separated out.
Well, I suppose I would say we have had strong advice from the Office for Legislative Counsel that these 5 pieces of legislation are interconnected and intertwined and must come through as a package together.
Okay, so lastly from myself, and it relates to the cost, some reservoirs will require costly upgrades and modifications to meet the proposed standards. And have you any data on the number of reservoirs that require those upgrades and modifications right now?
So until the Act comes in, and the reservoirs can't be designated. So until the reservoir is designated, then it can't receive an inspecting engineer to look at that, to tell us what the matters of interest and safety are. They could range. We have very little visibility of any potential capital costs as to what they might be, because until the reservoirs are inspected, nobody really knows that. So we have some data from the audits that were carried out back in 2015, but until the inspections are done by the inspecting engineers, it's really very hard to say.
And within that time, quite a few will have already done works, because, as you say, in the absence of the legislation, a number are working within the scope of it anyway. So there will have been safety measures that will have been carried out at a cost as well to some of those groups and some of those owners at this particular time. I'm now going to move on to the Deputy Chairperson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thanks very much, folks, for coming again and for the questions I've answered so far. Just to dive in to a couple of the points that the Chair talked about. Just, I think at the start you said that there were some that were doing well and were acting in the spirit of the oncoming, and others that weren't, and they had flagged up some concerns. I think, Rand, you'd said that some were a concern on a health and safety basis, but we just said to the Chair that those assessments haven't been carried out. So are those concerns that you have based on the 2015-16 assessments?
There has been audits carried out by the department, or visits carried out by the department since then. I don't have the details. It would be our Rivers Directorate who have the detail on that, because they carry that out. We are the policy side.
Okay.
But I know, I don't have them to hand. There was a number of reservoirs that were of grave concern.
Because grave is quite a big word, and obviously health and safety is a massive issue here. And I know you haven't been in a position to carry out audits to anticipate potential costs, but those ones that are grave, is there any assessment as to what the financial implications would be, either through a grant scheme or for the reservoir owner and manager themselves, just to gauge, are we talking tens of thousands, or are we talking millions? Because I'm not a reservoir expert, and you guys are in, I'm not saying that you are, but you're certainly more knowledgeable than I would be. So I'm trying to get a flavour for how vast an issue this might be when we start to look at the engineers coming in and doing these audits. And are we talking multiple tens of millions of pounds here?
We could be. We just
Okay.
don't know. This is about matters in the interest of safety. So the inspecting engineers are going in and identifying the matters of the interest and safety. They will be different for all reservoirs, and that's where the designation process is so important, because that inspecting engineer, the department will designate high, medium or low, and that in itself will help, I guess, prioritise in some respects those. But until an inspecting engineer goes in, there is no visibility of exactly what is required.
I suppose, Alison, what I'm trying to say is somebody from the department has gone out and assessed the ones that are the worst offenders currently. And Ryan used the word grave, and we're talking about health and safety. So somebody must have done a back of a fag packet analysis on how bad the ones that are grave are. And there must be a flavour for, are we talking to, I know what you're saying about the process needs to happen, but somebody must be saying, do you know what, this is really bad here, and this is going to require millions of pounds, despite this legislation coming in or not. And if they're not going to do it, the department's going to do it. I'm just trying to get a flavour for how bad that might be and how costly that might be. But that, you were saying that hasn't been done in terms of someone doing a rough costing at this stage?
All we would have would be estimates, and they wouldn't be definitive, because
Well, ballpark would be good.
We must remember, though, that there are 176 controlled reservoirs.
I'm just talking about the
Vast
really bad ones.
majority of
Yeah.
those are within the control of Northern Ireland Water and the councils.
Okay.
And so in terms of health and safety, they are complying with the Act and the spirit of the Act.
Yes.
And those would, I guess, be the very big reservoirs. And just to be clear, that the grant is probably only going to be proposed for the smaller reservoirs, and again, those who need it. So we would have a smaller percentage in the private and not-for-profit sector.
Right. And are they the ones then that are the worst, most concerning at this moment in time?
I can't stand it. This was a report done by our Rivers colleagues. I mean, we can get that to you.
No bother. It's more just because I know how under pressure the department is. So I suppose what I'm trying to get my head around is when this comes in, how vast the problem's going to be for either the owners and managers who might be willing to stand still financially, or ultimately the department, because as you've said, the department is the one, if the owners and managers can't implement the work that needs done, who are going to pick up the pieces.
The department has powers to ensure that the reservoir is made safe.
Right, and it'll be the ones that are in the worst state right now, if they can't be done by the owners and managers, that the department will be fixing. And that's what I'm trying to get a flavour for. Are we talking tens or hundreds of millions of pounds here? And that's, I suppose, the most concerning. Just moving on, the reservoirs, visits, supervisors, engineers, stop notices and grants regulation, which is a bit of a mouthful. In terms of the supervising engineers that are appointed, how are they identified? How are they qualified? How many are there? Do we have them here? Are they coming in? And in terms of the frequency of the assessments, how has that been gauged to be? Is it 12 months for high consequence, 36 for medium? How was that done? Is that based on elsewhere in terms of how they're done?
Well, that's a lot of questions.
Sort of interconnected.
Brian, I'll pass over to you.
I'll try and keep the first part. In terms of the engineers, where we're getting them from, we are extremely light here.
Okay.
But what we have set up with ICE, the Institute of Civil Engineers, is that in advance of the Act coming in, we have an agreement with them that their current panel engineers who work under, I think it's the Reservoirs Act 1975, that covers England and Wales, they will go out to them and see who wants to put their hand up and be considered for appointment over here.
Yes.
And for first appointments, anybody who is qualified under the legislation in England and has shown the correct qualifications and experience, etc., will automatically be valid to come over here and take appointments over here.
Okay.
So we will be covered, all being well, for panel engineers here.
Brilliant.
But we are light on them in this
area.
Yeah.
So part of my question is probably very, very long. How have you assessed then that frequency as being the right frequency? Is that based on elsewhere on these islands in terms of 12 and 36 months, or is that just something that the department has gauged to be the most appropriate?
I'm not sure that came back. That was brought through in 2015. It's the 12 for the high cut, one visit every 12 months for high
36 months for medium.
36, I think it is,
Yes.
for the medium. And
consequence.
then if your reservoir is deemed of an acceptable standard, that 12 for the high becomes 24.
Okay.
And I think it becomes 60 months then for the medium consequence. So that's once every 5 years, once every 2 years for a supervising engineer.
Okay. Just two more small points. The Chair raised about communication to date. Once this comes in, then how does the department plan to continue to raise awareness and communicate with reservoir owners, managers and the public, I suppose, to raise awareness of what's going on and how the scheme will look and how the grant scheme will look?
So our Rivers colleagues have been liaising with reservoir managers throughout this entire intervening period, so they write to them quite regularly around that. Obviously, if the Minister is content to put out a consultation on a potential grant scheme, then there would be a consultation process around that where we would engage, and we do meet at request with reservoir managers if they wish.
Okay, that's great. And the final thing then, prior to 2021, DARD were in charge of these, and the Chair had asked whether there were any concerning health and safety breaches. You're not aware of any since 2021. Is there any way of liaising with DARD just to see whether there were locations where incidents had popped up in the past, that maybe a plastic and plaster solution had been found, and that they'd be the ones that we most want to have eyes on, I suppose?
We can ask our Rivers colleagues, because actually at that time in 2015 Rivers were part of the then DARD, and then they came across to us, so I think we could probably go back and ask our Rivers colleagues, because I think there would probably be some of them that were there in 2015 and came across to DFI in 2016,
just to get a flavour for
so we
those.
can ask them if they can find some of that from historical records for you.
Okay, no problem. That's all from me at this time.
Sorry for that. Would have been useful just for the committee to have that.
Yes.
Cahill?
There's nothing left. I'm not learning the chair or
Do you
vice chair
think so?
the question anymore. But and having said all that, thanks very much for your presentation. And I mean, for one, I was involved in some of it. Clearly, the sooner we get the legislation, then we get those people applying, because the three main issues was the funding and supports. Obviously, there's an issue of the anglers, which the chair has mentioned, the concern, besides the safety element, but those who manage or use the reservoirs in some way. I'm just trying to think of the other one. Yes, the other one was the engineers, whether we had enough engineers to do it, but just my question probably is, how soon do you think we can get this process? Now, obviously, we have to agree it here, but because the sooner we recognise who wants to undertake it, you've identified clearly who's going to be responsible and who's not. And it's the individual managers who are concerned, what costs there are, what they can do. So my main question is, how soon can we get this process up and going so that we can identify people can apply, we can start to designate, because that's going to be key, is how we go forward.
Well, absolutely, and I guess if you like, the starting point of this is at the point at which the legislation is laid. So it's a mixture of, I think I said before, negative and affirmative. So some of it requires a debate in the Assembly, and the regulations that cover the grant do. So the starting process is obviously to get that approved and to get those pieces of legislation laid, and then there would be a draft affirmative debate in the Assembly. Until such times as that happens, nothing can be introduced, and the public safety risk remains.
And see, in terms, just my final question, because most of them have been asked in terms of all the techniques. Obviously, there was a big lobby in terms of the anglers. We feel we can address those issues. And obviously, they're very strong in consultation, but there's a lot of them do use some of the reservoirs out there, especially down my own way. I'm not going to mention them, but it was a strong lobby in terms of that. There, it is a serious issue for them, to be honest.
Yes, and our previous minister met with the anglers directly earlier in the year, in February time, and heard and listened to a lot of their concerns.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, I mean, a lot of the stuff has been covered. I suppose it may be more of a rhetorical question or a point, just that there's concern that you don't reduce public access inadvertently, you know what I mean? I understand health and safety, but like all these things, it's whenever that then curtails use, it's always a bit of a double-edged sword. Just one sort of slight segue, because it's been mentioned here before about flooding prevention and construction of more upland sort of reservoirs in order to store. I'm just wondering, will this legislation bear any effect on potential future reservoir construction, flood alleviation schemes further upland?
So this is quite separate to flood storage. So if flood storage was to come forward, that would require separate legislation. So this legislation is purely contained with implementing the Reservoirs Act as the Assembly approved in 2015. Flood storage would require separate legislation to come forward in respect of that.
But then would any new constructed reservoirs then fall under this legislation? Right.
Yes, indeed.
So it would affect it eventually then?
Any reservoir that is a controlled reservoir, which is 10,000 cubic metres and above, would be subject to this legislation at the point in time at which it comes in, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Keith?
Thanks for coming along. Just a couple of quick questions. I maybe missed this. See the possible grant, we'll call it, based on the 176 reservoirs. Is that possible grant open to every organisation, whether it be privately owned or council owned?
That would be for the Minister's consideration as part of the consultation.
So that's not...
That would be put out in the consultation as part of the options.
And do you see whenever a reservoir has to be inspected, does there have to be any enabling works carried out to the reservoir for that person to carry out the inspection? Or is it purely a visual, if some of those things can be all grown over and you can see very little. So can they carry out the inspection without any cost apart from their fee?
That would be, I guess, a technical question for our rivers. We didn't bring our rivers colleagues today because we thought we were focusing on the legislation, but I can certainly check with them if that would be the case. And
the initial possible grant where I keep referring to, I take it that's for the first initial assessment of the reservoir. That wouldn't be year 2, year 3, year 4. That's the first
it's
initial.
An initial inspecting cost and the inspecting cost and an initial visit from supervising engineer.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And is any thought then, the last question, on with respect to costs required to bring that, I know it's been touched on, that reservoir up to standard. So let's say the initial fees, whatever it is, between 5 and 10, but then there's works to carry out. Is any thought on the grant for that works? Because that could be, as John talked about, that could be anything.
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, it would be likely that a further consultation would be required for that once we get a feel for the scale of that. But this legislation, in terms of the powers that this will be bringing in, would cover a grant of that nature in the future as well.
Section 1.4 covers a grant for all applications for reservoir manager, which includes your initial cost, but also addressing matters in the interest of safety.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, I just want to check, Mark or Nicola, have you any questions? No, Mark?
No, Chair, much of it has, or all of it really has been covered there. But just in terms of trying to extract that information as to whether there have been any incidents or any safety or breaches or concerns over that intervening period, would it be possible to collate also, I suppose, the impact of the Act as it was, if you like, or as it is, on planning applications and so forth? Do you know, it underlines the need, and that's why DFI finally got this over into the department, was the impediment that the reading of the Act and how it interfaced with PPS 15 was actually, I suppose, affecting planning applications in a number of areas, not least my own. But it would be good to gauge what, I suppose, had been the cost almost of that inaction, and I'm not blaming DFI for it.
Well, we would have to ask our planning colleagues, but you are right in highlighting that in the absence of the Act and the absence of the public safety risk being addressed, there is planning applications are affected in terms of our Rivers colleagues are statutory consultees in planning applications, and therefore in the absence of this legislation then there can sometimes in planning responses be queries around the safety and the inundation zones of the reservoirs, and that has impacted in the past planning applications. I wouldn't have that detail today, but I can certainly ask the planners. I think they would probably be able to give you numbers of ones that have been affected. I'm not so sure if they'll be able to give you the cost, but I can certainly ask.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Cathal, you to
Yeah, just quickly, Chair, because the other point in my head was obviously as part of the consultation was the role of the reservoir manager, and that's where the big concerns is. The role's not clearly defined. Is the role clearly defined, or will that be a part of the consultation again as going forward? Do you know what I mean? If they decide to apply, because I mean, clearly that was one of the things that came up, you know, yes, the roles and responsibilities, and that's why some people would be a wee bit apprehensive as to take that role on, or maybe it's their responsibility anyway. So
well, Hannah can refer you to the legislation and the role. So the role is set out in the legislation.
Yeah, section 6. So to be a reservoir manager, you have to be an owner or a manager. So yeah, that would be. Let me just refer to what the legislation says.
Section 5 says any person who manages or operates the reservoir or any part of it is the reservoir manager of that reservoir.
Yeah. Oh, but what I'm thinking is, as they go forward, I understand that part of it, but it's the role going forward and looking after it. That's why they asked for the funding in the first place, and the response. That was one of the major responsibilities. Is any other like bylaws or any other things need to be talked about in terms of their roles, or anything? None.
It'll be up to the reservoir manager.
It's right, okay.
Or in the absence of a grant, yeah.
Right, okay, and obviously through council as well, depending on.
Yeah, if they're the reservoir
right,
manager.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I just have a few more questions. Following on from that, in terms of right now, are you aware of any reservoirs that don't have a known owner or manager at this particular point in time?
Our Rivers colleagues have written out to the reservoir managers that they know of. So at the minute, we are aware of the 176 controlled reservoirs, and that's, I guess, why we're keen to have the legislation in place, because some of that does rely on reservoir managers coming forward to register. The ones that we know of are the 176. We don't know. I guess we don't know what we don't know. You know. So at the minute, we know there's 176.
So that leads me to another question, because I'm thinking, you know, what work is being undertaken, and particularly in that period of 10 years, and I know I accept some of that was DERA, transferred over to DFI, but what work has taken place or any scoping out work that has taken place with your colleagues to find out any further reservoirs that may be there, because they may be the ones that are actually the main health and safety concern whenever you don't know who's actually looking after them right now?
I can certainly go back to our Rivers colleagues and check, but I do know that they have done a lot of work in the preceding 10 years, and I think they're fairly confident that they've got most of the controlled reservoirs. But I can certainly ask if they have any further update. But we would ask; they would be telling us, the controlled reservoirs, so they would be aware of 176 at the moment.
Okay. Can I just check out, in terms of the volume, which we know is 10,000 cubic metres for a reservoir, how is that volume calculated and how frequently is that undertaken? And how does this compare with calculations used in other jurisdictions? And how accurately can this be calculated?
The 10,000 threshold was agreed by the Assembly back in 2015, and I think that's the volume. I'm not technical, I'm not an engineer, but that's the volume that reservoir engineers generally agree that if there was an uncontrolled release of water as a result of reservoir failure, has the potential to result in the loss of life.
Yes, so that was what was agreed, but I'm asking, how is this calculated to understand the reservoirs at present that fall under that? That's what I'm trying to understand.
So the technicalities of how that is calculated is set out in the set of regulations, and our Rivers colleagues would be over the fine technical detail of that. We couldn't answer those technical questions today, but I can get Rivers to write to you on that.
Yeah.
In terms of other jurisdictions, Wales moved to 10,000 in 2016 from the 25, and England are currently going through a reform period where they're moving from 25 to 10 as well.
Okay.
And Scotland also have provision to move as well, so they could at some point too.
Sorry, I missed that.
Scotland also have provision to be able to move to the 10,000 cubic metres too.
Okay. But in terms of the legislation and that 10,000 cubic metres, my understanding is whenever the reservoir managers designate, they also, if they want to deregulate in terms of, or if they want to try and make sure that they move from a high or a medium or a low, they have to get that engineer report, which is going to cost them. So is there not scope to take the department's measurements instead of them having to employ an engineer for that?
Well, it's a very specialist field and a very specialist technical area. So the department would look to assurance from an inspecting or supervising engineer around technical calculations like that.
So from a departmental point of view, we are actually also bringing in specialist engineers in terms of making sure the calculations match up. Will we be
technical area that I can't answer questions on it? I would have to refer to our Rivers colleagues for that.
And can I just check, has there been any pushback or disputes with the methodology or approach in terms of calculating reservoir volumes, or with the reservoir managers or owners that you know of at this moment in time?
Again, Rivers colleagues would deal with that type of technical detail. I wouldn't be aware of any of those at the moment. Our Rivers colleagues would lead in those types of discussions.
Okay, the Deputy Chair is looking back
Thank you.
in.
I'm sorry for coming back in, but I just want to get my head around a point. You'd mentioned, Alison, that in a situation where a reservoir owner or manager is either unable to or doesn't do the works that needed to be carried out to bring it up to an acceptable standard, health and safety wise, that the department will step in and make good effectively on that reservoir.
The department will step in the interest of safety.
Yes, that's what I mean. So where they don't do it, if there's a safety concern and the owner or manager doesn't do it, the department will step in. Does that currently happen or will happen on the back of these regulations?
So that power to do that is contained within this bill.
Yes.
So the commencement is required
before that can happen.
That,
will
yes.
that then require the department to have a budgetary code set aside each year specifically for the what if that happens? If you see what I mean, going forward, so will there have to be a pot of money set aside given that that could be quite a costly experience potentially, will that be something that the department have to factor into its budgetary processes?
Well, in the event that an emergency developed, then that would be funded. And I mean, we deal with lots of emergencies and flooding and what have you. And,
yes, so
and
come out of
there's
the
a
flooding budget
mechanism
potentially,
for that.
their capital budget.
But just to be clear, the department's role is to step in the interest of safety. It isn't to step in and do the works per se. It is to make the reservoir safe, which may be as a first step to drain it down, as opposed to doing the work. So I think that's an important clarification.
Right. Okay. So that might be all that happens as they go in, insist that it's drained away, and then put an enforcement. For example, do you have the power then to enforce onto the owner to carry out the works that needed to be done on the back of that?
The enforcement provisions, I think we provided those to you the last time we were here. There's a range of enforcement provisions, and the department can issue stop notices, and there's enforcement around what happens if the stop notices don't take. But those are very operational matters for our river colleagues once the
that's been really
legislation's
useful.
enacted.
There's a bit of ambiguity in my head around whether you would actually carry the work out or just get it to be made safe. So
this is about the purpose of the legislation is
Yes.
about
Make
providing
safe.
a reservoir safety framework
Yes.
and ensuring that the public risk there is reduced as far as possible. But as I said earlier, in the absence of the legislation, that public
nothing to be
safety
done.
risk
Okay,
remains.
that's grand. Thank you so much. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I do have more points to raise here because, look, coming from Fermanagh and South Tyrone, there's a lot of waterways around my area, but it is important because what we are trying to scope out here from a committee perspective is, yes, we have the legislation in front of us, but what we're trying to scope out is the potential unintended consequences of what this legislation will mean. And that's why we are asking these questions, which may be technical in nature, resulting from some of your, in terms of some of your colleagues in rivers, but this is what we need to do to make sure that it works, that the legislation works for people that are on the ground that we represent. I just want to go back to the legislation regarding the grant scheme. And you'd said there that OCL had given obviously the strong evidence that the 5 pieces have to come together and are intertwined. But as you've heard today, quite an awful lot centres around that grant scheme, and I suppose that's why I'm looking at it. If there is such a concern with health and safety, and there is a need to make sure that health and safety is adhered to, why can't that registration, designation, all of that be implemented and the grant scheme then separated out? Was that part of the deliberations with the OCL in scoping out whether that is a possibility that can be extracted out?
So in order to enact this piece of legislation, there are very few clauses that have been commenced. So as the first step is the commencement orders in order to commence those and the regulations. If we were to bring forward the set of regulations for the grant standalone, I'm not really sure how that would work, because if we didn't have people registered and designated, the grant would have no purpose, because people have to be registered and designated before they can get an inspecting engineer to come in. So
the grant is a concern for an awful lot of the smaller not-for-profit voluntary sort of organisations, and for me, some of the unintended consequence of this is there is actually no safeguard. There's no guarantee that that grant scheme will be brought in for those groups. And so whenever it comes to registration, an awful lot of them groups are going to walk away.
So,
because there's nothing there that says to them, I will definitely be able to fund this. I will definitely have, we don't even know, there's a consultation, we don't even know the time scale of that consultation. Is there any indicative time of when that consultation may come out?
We're just finalising it, and then it'll go to the Minister for consideration. But I guess maybe just a general point. The grant scheme in this context is quite unusual. So normally bringing in legislation and being compliant with legislation is enough of a driver to to drive the action that's required. In this case, the grant is funding something that reservoir managers will be required to do under legislation. That's an unusual situation, and as I think I said in my opening remarks, it is the only area in the entire British Isles that is proposing that measure. It is a permissive power under section 114, but the Minister has indicated, the previous Minister and this Minister, that they recognise that there is a consequence and therefore is bringing in a grant to try and mitigate that. But in order to provide a grant to any of these reservoir managers, the reservoir needs to be designated in order that it can be inspected.
Okay, well, look, I don't see anybody else. Sorry, I'll go to Keith here first.
I appreciate your point, you have to be registered and designated, but at that point in time, say I own one which I don't, and I register and designate, I've put my hand up, I own this thing.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, you're not getting a grant now. You're in a financial position straight away. And I appreciate you still have a responsibility, but there need to be some assurance, depending on what the definition of insurance is, that there'll be financial support to assist these organisations, because the minute they register and designate, that's it. The grant doesn't come.
And I think the previous Minister did state publicly that he is aware of the consequences, but that in the interest of complying with managing public money and ensuring better value for money, it is essential that the grant is only provided to those who need it.
And just to say, it is caveated around the grant scheme that it's down to budget availability. And we know that the budget in the department, we're cash strapped. It's a concern. It is a concern for me anyway. Cahill?
No, sir, and that's why I was trying to expand on the roles, because the broad principle introducing the legislation is fine, and then the secondary outline what to do. And my point is, as you move on, how things adapt and change. We've learned a lot of things through consultation, so need to be clear now. I understand the principle. You need to bring legislation in, because to be fair, the grant is a good idea, and we are strapped in budgets, Chair, but that was the whole fight and argument at the time the original bill was, because the legislation could be brought in to certain adherence to people what they have to do now anyway. But my thing is the grant. But my point is, we need to find out the rivers, all the stuff we talked about the Rivers Agency, a more technical detail. I'd like that sent through as well to see, because there's been a lot of discussions there. There are more over the technical stuff, and the Chair has raised a number of points there, and it was raised at the time of the previous consultation as to what raised its head. But I understand, for some of us who've done the legislation, we understand the commencement, but we need to look at that seriously if we're to move that on fairly quickly, because the responsibility will go back onto some of the regulations that are there now as exists.
Yeah.
So that's the point as well. So, but like I say, I'd like to see that information from the Rivers Agency in terms of what the Chair has asked previously. Okay.
Just in relation to the grant, maybe to add to that, so under managing public money and the compliance requirements of that, we can't provide a grant in advance of need. We can't make commitments in advance of budgets being available, and that's the same for everybody.
One final question: do we know what it costs to inspect a reservoir in England? Is there a standard fee there?
It's between the £5,000 and £10,000.
Okay. That's for the grant. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Can I just double check, what, if any, powers does the department have if somebody doesn't designate?
So the enforcement powers, I think we sent those to you after our last appearance. That's
just double check what that would look like again.
Do you have those, Ryan?
Yes, there are a range of enforcement. I'm just trying to put my hand to it, but I think around the registration, I think it's like fines.
Yeah. So no matter what, this is a point. No matter what, those smaller groups are stuck in potentially in either a financial penalty or another financial penalty in terms of having to employ the engineers.
No enforcement now is the department's view. It's going to be very much a last resort. They want to work with reservoir managers in bringing this in.
That's why the grant.
Okay, Mark, I see your hands up there.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's almost an aside, but not quite. It was just like, obviously at the heart of this is public risk and risk to the public, but a lot of focus is on the structural integrity of reservoirs. But could I just ask that the department ensure that there's no doubt, or sorry, that we ensure that maybe where there is any doubt about who currently has responsible for what, that we don't allow that doubt to create danger. I'm just conscious of the sun shining outside, and as we approach the warmer weather, some members of the public would swim in our reservoirs and put themselves at risk. So just to ensure that the department has a campaign in place and is working with responsible reservoir managers where we have them, and with others where we might not have them, to ensure that every step's taken and every precaution taken to protect life this summer.
Yeah, and our Rivers colleagues have been doing that in the intervening period. But as I said in my opening remarks, that their powers are limited without this legislation, and the reservoir managers, their responsibilities fall under common law. So without this legislation being enacted, the public safety risk remains, and the department cannot take forward a lot more really without that. So in the absence of the legislation going forward, we are relying on common law responsibilities.
Yeah, even in terms of public information campaign and stuff like that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, look, thank you. That's all for now, though there are, as I said, those points to pick up with in terms of your colleagues in DFI Rivers. Obviously the incidents, the amount of incidents is one that we've raised today. About the reservoir calculation was another one that came up, and I'd asked around the methodology, whether there was pushbacks or disputes around the methodology and approach used to calculate. I think
Deregulation, was it?
Yes, around deregulation and things like that. So I'm not sure that there was any other points, but we'll check back in anyway in relation to that. But that was some of the ones that I had noted down there in terms of some of the things that we want to just check up again. But look, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Members, as you know, we will be having another evidence session in relation to the Reservoirs Act as well. So in terms of dull stranglers who'll be coming in as well. So today wasn't for us to decide upon them, it was obviously to gather some evidence in relation to the legislation that's before us. So does anybody have any comments or anything that they want to check in on or check up?
See the first session we had, Chair, did we get a breakdown of 176? I know they give us a breakdown there about council stroke NI water stroke private, but was any breakdown given of the medium or high?
So
was that on the first session? I can't remember.
So I remember that we did ask in the first, thanks Keith, because it was something I forgot to actually raise. In the first session we did actually ask for the breakdown of the figures, medium, low, high, I think. So it's something that we could maybe check back on. Yeah, to get that.
John covered the point, so if you have 100, it'd be good to get a sort of a wee synopsis of that 176 again. Who owns what? A wee table, and what they guesstimate as low, medium and high, because that would determine grant. That grant could be, for argument's sake, 10,000 for each one, or could it just be 3? We don't know. But they're about to have an idea of what a guesstimate of what's medium and high risk.
Yeah. So we'll get that checked out, because it was something that we did ask for in the very first session that we had on this back in November, I think that was. So we'll get that checked out again, Keith, to get that information. Any other points?
I suppose it was just back to my point, Chair, that I raised. Maybe I did it in a poor manner, but what I was trying to tease out was one of the officials talked about the grave concerns that they had regarding some of these relating to health and safety, and I suppose I'm trying to get my head around how grave and how imminent is that problem likely to be? Is it, are we talking like almost immediate? Because grave's a pretty big word.
Yeah.
And secondly, somebody must have done a calculation, ballpark figure, what we're talking about here. If someone's been out and assessed it as grave, they're the ones I'm concerned about, not the ones that are low risk and maybe need a little bit of this and that. I'm talking about the ones that are the most concerning to the department right now, where someone has had eyes on to it and gone, this is really needing flagged up and needing done. And are we talking that maybe something needs done before this legislation comes in, or these regulations come in? And what does that cost? I don't feel like I'm any the wiser. I'm not an expert. I don't know how much it costs to make a reservoir right if it's wrong. But somebody must have an idea.
Yeah, well, I'll refer to the clerk in a minute, but I know of one example in my constituency where I have been working with that group, and they have been classified as high consequence, and they have done an awful lot of work in the intervening periods of time, which was planned, but they have done an awful lot of work to ensure that their safety is of a very, very high standard. Those people care for that area. They and there is like virtually, if you were there, you could see it for yourself. Like there's virtually no risk around that, because of the safety measures that they have done. But they're going to be in a position where they're going to be, whenever they register, they're going to be high consequence. They're going to have to go through getting the engineer's report to try and get declassified.
Yes.
And that's going to be an awful lot of cost to them. It's going to be an awful lot of pressure and stress on a very small group as well. So, I mean, it's those unintended type consequences that you're right in terms of pointing out. Sorry, if you want to come in.
No, it's fine, thanks, Chair. It was just in the course of the evidence, and I think officials had actually referenced to some audits that were undertaken in 2016, and that obviously, I mean, there's a degree that the department doesn't have definitive data until the commencement of the Act. Or the remaining parts of the Act coming forward, but there was a reference to audit, so it may be that that's the basis of that. So I mean, I know they'd suggest they could perhaps provide some of that work done by Rivers Agency, which happens to be were previously in DERA. So that could be something the committee could just seek to explore. That might give a little bit more background, I suppose, the basis of whether what is considered to be of a certain standard.
Yeah, that might be useful.
Yeah, Cahill, you were looking in.
Yeah, Chair, I mean, John, to be fair, there's been a lot of assessments done. You know, that you know, and there's a lot of information. The thing for me was to see the grants issue, because it wasn't on the radar at the very start. And to be fair, all the lobbying and all the, because I met many in Angler too, and they were very, very concerned. So, but the Rivers Agency probably should have been up today to answer, some of the questions that come raise his head. But if we get that information back, but I understand it is caught between the responsibility. You own it, so you apply, and then we'll get. But I'd say the grant system. Hopefully, the grant stuff will work out. But like I say, let's get the other answers, and then you said the anglers are coming up as well, and we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, it's about us understanding what will actually happen behind the legislation, and if we're not doing that. I have a fair idea what's going to happen, Chair, but I mean, that's to say the grants issue is an issue for them. Yeah. There is that for sure, But I'd like to know how many. You asked how many officially, out of the 176. We'll try to break those numbers down. So maybe we could ask the Rivers Agency, they have all that detail. That's what my impression? Yeah, let's get that detail out, Okay, well look, we'll still be continuing to look at it, and as I say, we still have the evidence sessions that are coming up as well, and I would say we'll probably have the department back maybe again in relation to the evidence that we're taking, because we need to make sure that we just have it right, because it is legislation, and obviously balancing the health and safety aspects as well. Okay, look, we'll move on. Item 8 is report on funding water infrastructure in Northern Ireland. It's the Northern Ireland Audit Office oral evidence, so at page 250 with the Northern Ireland Audit Office cover letter. At page 251 you'll see the Northern Ireland Audit Office funding water infrastructure in Northern Ireland written evidence. We welcome to the committee Ms Colette Keane, Director of the Northern Ireland Audit Office, and Mr Michael Heery, Audit Manager at Northern Ireland Audit Office. You're very welcome to the committee today. We appreciate your time. We thank you for coming with us today. Cathal, sorry.
I'll take the opportunity to declare it now, Chair. I'm a member of the PAC.
Perfect, no
I
problem.
was a member of the PAC when the audit report was published.
Perfect, thank you. So, as per usual, look, we obviously have the report. Members have went through that whenever it was first published as well, I am sure, and we have it in our packs today. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to let you briefly outline in an opening statement for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to come to members' questions. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. So I'll start off and then I'll pass over to Michael. So just to say thank you very much for the invitation today. And we are very aware that this subject in particular remains one of constant focus for this committee, for the wider executive and the public. We published the report in 2024, March 24, just over a year ago. And so we'd point out the statistics are within the report are somewhat dated at this point. However, we still believe that the overall key issues are the same. The report itself is not our usual form of a value for money report, which we normally would produce, but rather a landscape review on how investment in water infrastructure has been managed over the last 2 decades. The report is a factual account really of how water, sewage and wastewater infrastructure investment is managed within the current policy context. And there's a couple of points I would really like to highlight to this committee in respect of the context of our report. So firstly, the legislation which establishes the role of the Controller and Auditor General, or the CNIG, does not permit her to question the policy objectives of any department. Therefore, the report itself has looked at the impact of those policy decisions which have been made, and Michael will highlight those to you. And secondly, I would also advise the committee that we are not the auditors of NI Water, but we are obviously the statutory auditors of the department. Members will note that whilst we do not raise any formal recommendations within the report, we have identified 2 key matters. Firstly, we have recognised in this report and other reports of our office that our office has produced the need for better coordination and management of infrastructure investment. And members may be aware of other reports, for example, major capital projects, etc., which touches in this area. And therefore, we think it is critical that all relevant stakeholders work towards the establishing arrangements to make this more effective. Secondly, and perhaps more specific to this report, we call for the Department and NI Water to complete a comprehensive review of the alternative funding and governance arrangements led by suitably qualified experts. This comes on the basis of the findings of the report, which clearly show a system under significant strain due to inadequate investment in water infrastructure over a number of years. So I'm going to ask Michael to highlight key parts of the report.
So thank you. So I was just intending really to draw the committee's attention to the 3 particular areas of the report. So the first of those are the issues that the report identifies that originate and arise from the establishment of NI Water that have created legacy problems since then. So within the report, we describe the process by which the proposal to establish NI Water as a company was formed, and describe the process by which the original proposals made by the Direct Rule Administration were amended. We also draw attention to the work of the Independent Water Review Panel and its recommendations about how water infrastructure should be self-financing and the risks it identified to the long-term sustainability of the arrangements that were being set up in 2007. I think that key issue really relates to the subsidy paid on behalf of domestic users, which creates a certain legal status for NI Water that has had implications through the years since. So the second key area of the report is really its overview of the price control and the development and maturation of the price control process in Northern Ireland since 2007. So the report highlights that there were 3 price controls whereby essentially the process got up and running fully. So there were initially preparatory price controls, and then price control 15 was the first major price control that covered a 6-year period and set a set of outputs for NI Water that should be delivered within a specific cost envelope. Whenever we looked then at PC21, we highlighted the significant increase in ambition evident within PC21 compared to the previous price control. And within figure 6, I think that provides a neat illustration of just the scale of the ambition of the Department, NI Water and Utilities Regulator, to really ramp up delivery of water infrastructure. But that graphic also highlights just the huge challenge over the long term for all decision makers to try and address capacity constraints. Finally, I suppose the third area to draw attention to is the report highlights concerns about the achievability of PC21 over its lifespan and then delivering the sustained level of high investment needed over the following decade. We reported in the third year PC24, we commended the department within the report for being able to fund the year-on-year increases evident in the first 2 years, but we highlighted the pressures that emerged in year 3, and we can understand that those pressures have continued. Finally, we try to draw out some of the issues that I'm sure the committee are well aware of in terms of development, in terms of environmental risks, and in terms of economic pressures that will arise from the failure to address capacity constraints. So I think that's a lot of time.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. There'll be questions, I'm sure, which will bring out some elements of the report. I'm just going to kick off in relation to, I noted in your report it says that you would encourage the Department in Northern Ireland Water to complete a comprehensive review of alternative funding and governance arrangements led by suitably qualified experts. So I suppose, how frustrated are you that hasn't come to be at this point in time, and who would need to be involved in leading that review? Who would be the suitably qualified experts that you think could help in terms of the Department and NI Water looking at that?
So within the report we highlight the 6 reviews that have taken place, which we didn't look at in any real detail. We didn't certainly quality review those, but I suppose what we looked at from the point of view of those 6 reviews was really the outcome, and we didn't see any tangible outcome from those. Most of those reviews were internally led by the department, and so we do feel that, looking back to the review that Michael talked about at the outset there, the 2007 independent water panel review, we do feel that one was probably set standard and did some of the conclusions that it came up with are still extant today. So looking back to that review, that was very much led by academics, but also experts in the field, around consumers. We have no real set view, Chair, in terms of who should be involved. We do feel that there needs to be a bit of scoping around that. It wouldn't be for us to do that, but we certainly think that people who are well versed in the types of models, and particularly funding and governance models that might have some workable solutions in there, would be best placed to be part of that. Could it possibly need to have some civil engineers, as well? This is a very complex area, potentially as well. But overall, we don't have really set views. We just feel that there needs to be the expertise partially reflected that was back in 2007 in that independent review that was carried out.
Okay, thank you. You're coming to the committee at a time when a forensic accountant has been appointed, and the minister has made an announcement around that. So I'm just interested in terms of your assessment of that in relation to the report that yourselves conducted, and does that point to better governance of water infrastructure, how it's being funded, how money is being spent?
Well, as I said at the outset, Chair, we're not the auditors of NI Water, so we don't have an in-depth knowledge of their spending or any of that, and we don't carry out those audits. So we have used the figures that have been provided to us within this report. I really couldn't comment any further than that, to be honest. at this point. So
okay, and in terms of the, I obviously noted the efficiency gap, and in 2008 the efficiency gap was 48% compared to 5.7% reported in 2018-2019. So it's there's been quite a reduction there in terms of the efficiency gap. Interesting to see whether that has changed now since that period of time. But what efficiencies or inefficiencies were identified?
I believe so the efficiency gap is essentially a composite measure of a range of different performance indicators applied to NI Water and compared to water companies in England and Wales. Now there's significant geographical differences, as I understand it, in Northern Ireland that result in it's not a direct like-for-like comparison. It has to be adjusted. So I believe the types of measures that go into it are in Appendix 1 of the report. So essentially the overarching figure that's in the figure within the graph is that the high level sort of gap between the efficiency being achieved, or the gap between the efficiency being achieved by NI Water versus its comparable companies. So it's not a single, a measure of just one thing, but the types of things would be, throughput of pipes, leakage rates, all these things that add up to ultimately the overall efficiency of the company.
Yeah. I suppose it's interesting in the context of that efficiency gap being closed given the funding, and it still would have been quite stretched funding at that particular time. Was that something that came up from an NI Water point of view of the importance for them of closing that efficiency gap?
I think that's sort of one of the key objectives of the regulatory regime that was introduced then. So, and the role of utilities regulator is about pushing NI Water to deliver efficiencies in its output and to use the resource that it's given to deliver against the price controls efficiently. So I think the Independent Water Review Panel and every other stakeholder we engaged with spoke about the legacy of underinvestment over the decades preceding the establishment of NI Water. So the extent of the efficiency gap we were seeing within the data then made sense within that context. And what you have is this new regime then established where the utilities regulators playing a role driving NI Water as a new company also to improve how it's performing, and that made sense within the framework that was created.
How long did it take for you to collate this report? What was the approach taken by the audit office? And did you encounter any difficulties along the process? So I'm thinking of the engagement that happens between NI Water and the department. Was that quite clear that there was a lot of engagement that took place, and in relation to all aspects of how NI Water conduct their business?
So in terms of the way we conduct our reports, we carry out the field work, we call it, with the different organisations and gather the information together. And then we go through what's called a clearance process. So all our reports are cleared through, and usually what happens is, and this is what happened in this case, was the department takes the lead in terms of clearance. So the department took the lead of the clearance for this report and collated the NI Water and the utility regulator. It was like a tripartite clearance, if you like, in this case. So we received, one response to that. The clearance process was slightly elongated because the Department of Finance are also involved in this as well. And they had some questions around, whether or not we were getting into policy areas, but we got away through that, so we were content in the end.
Okay, and did the department put any caveats, or did they change any elements of the report because they have sight of that and are able to provide final clearance? Was there anything that they were sort of pushing on to change in relation to this? Because funding is a very important element for NI Water. Was there anything that they sort of indicated that they weren't happy about in terms of the report?
No, I think we did get to an agreeable position. There's always, when in our clearance process, there's always a bit of, to and froing really, I suppose. But there was nothing that strikes me that they were particularly concerned with. We had a number of meetings with them. And what we try to do as well is also to alert them when we come up with our findings along the way. As I say at the outset, this is a very factual report, so we didn't expect that there would have been a huge amount coming out of it.
Okay, I'm going to go to the Deputy Chair.
Okay, Colette and Michael, thank you for coming along. It's a very comprehensive report, but we expect nothing less from the Northern Ireland Audit Office, and thank you so much for the work. The Chair's covered some of the pretty important points. One of the things I'm going to look at, I don't want to drag you down because I know you won't go there into the policy framework or anything to do with that, but there has been much discussion about the potential for reform of the framework and the borrowing powers associated with Northern Ireland Water, or however that's looked at. If that was to be the case, would an ONS reclassification be required in order for any amendments to both the framework and the borrowing powers that Northern Ireland Water or any similar organisation would have?
I suppose there's a slight misconception, John, around the borrowing powers that NI Water, because NI Water do have borrowing powers through the department. They can't obviously afford to borrow a huge amount because it obviously scores against the DEL for the department, as well as being able to service that debt, let's say. So. And they are able to, in their current format, to borrow against in capital markets as well, but again it scores against DEL, so there's a sort of, it's counterintuitive really. So I suppose to make the most of, as we understand it, to make the most of borrowing powers, and there's a number of models out there. Yes, the ONS classification as an NDPB would have to change. Yes, that's our understanding. Yeah. Okay.
One of the things that was those that maybe suggested that mutualisation, for example, wouldn't be required, but said that it would require billing, but Northern Ireland ratepayers already pay for Northern Ireland Water through the rates bill. So did part of this report, or did any audit office ever look at what a line on a rate bill might look like in terms of a costing, and how practical that might be to put a costing on a rate bill for Northern Ireland Water ring fence specifically, given that the ratepayers of Northern Ireland are already paying for the service through that?
We didn't look at that specifically, but I'm just referencing back to the independent water panel. They actually did, when I looked at a report again the last couple of days, they actually did look right down to, and that was their recommendation, was that it should be put onto the rates, an additional amount. But just to update you as well, I understand the Fiscal Council are preparing a report which is to be published, and it will go into a bit more detail on the different options. Now, I don't know that it goes right down to that detail that you're talking about, but certainly the different options around mutualisation, privatisation, those sort of options would be within their remit, and obviously they can comment more on policy than we can.
Is that Fiscal Council report due in the next quarter, I think, June or July?
Yeah, I understand before June is what I've been told,
would be good to know. The final point, Chair, I want to comment on point 4 of the executive summary about the need to prioritise effective use of funding available has limited investment in sewage and wastewater infrastructure. I suppose my question relates to, at what point does the system start to break down? Because if they're throwing it where it's statutory obligated, Northern Ireland Water has a colossal logistical and infrastructural base that isn't being maintained to the need that it needs to be maintained to. So that therefore leads to a more costly maintenance programme every year because it's not being maintained, but that's not happening. So eventually the system breaks down because the money is currently not there at the minute, but it won't be there next year or the year after, and the cost will be even higher. So I was wondering what the Northern Ireland Audit Office's assessment was of the long-term viability of the system before it starts to get to a point where it's unmanageable.
We didn't look, I suppose, at that specifically, but what I can say is that our understanding of the PC regime and the way that is prioritised is that there's three priorities. So the first is water quality, and they prioritise the water quality. The second is around the maintenance of existing assets, as we understand it, and the third is new investments. So, you know, in a way, if there is some money, it's sort of in that priority rating. Is there anything else you want to say on that? I suppose the figure 6.
I think I suppose the report, I suppose what you're referring to is essentially a sort of compounding inefficiency that's going to effectively, and I suppose the way we've interpreted that is in the figure 6 in the report, essentially the orange lines are the massive investment has to be delivered in PC21. What's not delivered there passes into the blue bars over the next decade, pushes those up and makes life harder for all decision makers involved delivering. I suppose the other aspect of it, I believe it's figure 7, what it shows in PC21, even in an environment of totally unconstrained resourcing, there's only so much capacity in construction markets and civil society to tolerate works on the scale that are needed. So I think $1 billion of what was accepted as being needed could not be delivered anyway within PC21. So this compounding effect would be future PCs will be hit with an ever-increasing amount that can't even be delivered should you secure additional finances that would theoretically allow delivery.
I think that's my point, Michael, and you make it really well. If we think it's bad now, we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of what it's going to look like in 10 years' time without that investment, because things are pretty bad now, but by underinvesting year after year after year, the cost of just standing still is so much more significant, never mind the development that's required as well on top of that. And I think until we wake up and realise that, we've got a serious problem. But thank you, that's been really useful. Thanks,
Thank you. Just to say, we have asked the Fiscal Council to come to committee, so they will be coming once their report has obviously been published, and they can take us through that, so which will be useful as well. Peter?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming in, guys. My first question relates to the elusive internal reports. I've raised this a number of times in the committee. You've had a chance to look at them. Are you able to tell us anything about these reports? The Minister has told us multiple times the funding mechanism for Northern Ireland Water has been looked at time and time again. But to me, it kind of feels like the department proposes these internal reports, someone looks at them, they mark it and say, great job, and then they just move on, get another one a few years later. No one's actually able to check the homework. So are you able to advise today, you know, who prepared the report, what findings did they have? Did they come to a positive conclusion in terms of the funding mechanisms?
So we have very briefly within the report outlined yeah. So, but really, to be honest, beyond that, we didn't quality review them. Okay, and the reason why we didn't do that was because we were really looking to see if there was outcome. You know, we were really just, it's the bottom line, really. You know, what change had been made, and you can see there within our report we have said there has been no substantial real changes to the funding or governance mechanisms because of them. Our understanding of the reports is, as you've described, you know, they're mostly internally generated reports. Some of them would have been at the request of a minister, if their minister was in place at the time. So beyond that, to be honest, I don't think we could comment any further. Is that fair enough?
I think the issue is, I suppose, classification of the organisation really comes down to degrees of control and financing sources, and ultimately there's so much flexibility within current arrangements, so you know, they've sort of conducted reviews within that framework.
Okay. And since the report's been published, how have you found engagement with the department? Has there been any further engagement, with the department to discuss what steps they've taken since then?
Well, we sort of talked about the not recommendations, but the sort of suggestions that we had made. Yes. So we did ask, particularly around the one around the comprehensive review. We did specifically ask around that, and I can just read you out what we have been told. So we were told that the work was being updated within the Minister's policy framework and in collaboration with NI Water. That's as far as the information we've been told. I know this has been discussed in the House a number of times as well, so we know that no review has happened. So, but beyond that, that's all the discussion we had.
The reason why I ask that is I'm working on a private members bill at the minute, and that's loosely connected to an IPSO report that was done. And about 6 months, maybe a year or so after the IPSO report about tree protection or tree preservation orders in Northern Ireland, Nothing really had changed. Probably the bleakest meeting I've ever had in my life, meeting with officials, because nothing had changed. We're now a year or so again in the future. Nothing's really changed. So my fear with this report, which is a fantastic report, is that not that much is going to come from it. Would that be your assessment, or or are there still sort of conversations taking place with the department around this report?
I suppose the difficulty is that and this is why we didn't have a recommendation, is because we were very aware of our constraint around policy. So this very much plays into the policy space as to whether or not the Minister wishes there to be a review to look at these areas. So we just had to be very careful as to how far we could push these things, Yeah.
And just to touch on something the Vice Chair said there about, where we could potentially be if we just stand still. Everyone will be aware of the Spotlight programme, human waste in Belfast Lough, human waste in the roads. Did you look at any positive approaches to water management, maybe across the UK, maybe in terms of Europe? Because my fear is I'm not seeing from my own research anyone that does it like us. So we're a bit of an outlier, probably in terms of even Europe. So did you look at any other best practice in terms of it?
We did outline some benchmarks across the rest of the UK as to the funding mechanisms and funding and governance. I suppose in terms of best practice, we have captured some of the things that NI Water are doing around the climate, hydrogen, using hydrogen, all of that type of thing, as being good practice, if you like. In terms of some of the innovative things that they're trying to do, albeit within a very constrained funding environment. And
just lastly, Chair, you'd mentioned, I can't remember who to, that there'd been engagement with departmental officials. Was there ever engagement with a minister or ministerial officials? Conscious there would have been a very narrow window of time for that. But was there ever any engagement with a minister or ministerial officials?
No, we didn't do that. No.
Okay.
Sorry, Michael just wants to come in there on
one point in terms of best practice. I suppose one area that we did say was Highways Authority in England, and some flexibilities that they had secured with Treasury about being able to flex a certain amount of their capital budget between financial years. So it by no means solves the overarching problem, but it's a measure that may help the organisations address some of the inefficiencies that result from the stop-start cycle of financial years, and having to get money out the door before the end of the year.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. Just on that last comment about Highways England, as I read it, it had ring-fence multi-year budgets and year-end financial flexibility. Do you think with such an arrangement, how much of an effect would that have, do you think, with NI Water?
I think we have constantly talked about multi-year budgets across a number of organisations, and how effective that would be. So that would be certainly very helpful, because given the nature of what we're talking about, infrastructure projects in particular, given the nature of those which are going to span 2-3 years sometimes, to have that certainty, and I think would put them in a very good position around negotiating with contractors, for example, securing contractors as well, and getting the best prices. But also, I think the year-end flexibility, I think you've had evidence just from NI Water around pausing. That uncertainty does create a huge issue, and we have highlighted in here too around in-year allocations and how reliant NI Water have been on in-year allocation. It isn't an unusual thing, but that does create that uncertainty, and it's to try and sort of, I think, for that point, only that point, of creating certainty, it certainly, I think, would be very helpful to have those two mechanisms.
Thank you. I suppose just going back, to this point 8 about comprehensive review on alternative funding and governance arrangements. I suppose the inference may maybe be that the previous reviews have maybe been lacking or not fully fleshed out as such. Is there an example, or is there like a perfect model, or is there good terms of reference that such a review would need to take into consideration?
I think just going back, we would say the starting point should be that independent water review panel that was back in the early 2000s, you know, because that was quite comprehensive. It was quite well led and did come out with solid recommendations. That would be a starting point, but obviously we've moved on 20 years since then, you know, so we would probably just need a wee bit more work around how to scope it out properly to make sure everything is captured that needs to be, including the outcome from committee's evidence as well, I think.
And again, final question, Chair. Thank you. It was sort of interesting to hear how you were the correspondence between yourselves and NI Water and the department. I suppose. Has there been much more since with the department? I know you mentioned about NI Water, but has there been much more with the department and just that clearance process? I mean, how can you expand upon that, or how does that process go? Or that's interesting.
Yeah. So when we draft our first drafts of the report, well, first of all, I should go back and say when we actually even scoping out the report, we did have meetings with the department to talk about the scope of the report and the different elements that we were intended to look at. And then along the way, we have various checkpoints with the department and partially to gather in more information and just to give them a steer as to sort of the findings we're coming up with. And then we enter into this formal clearance process, which is the same for all our reports. So when we have a first draft of the report, it goes to the department who took the lead in terms of clearance with the NI Water and utility regulator, and we get a response back from them after some weeks, and then we look at that and decide whether or not we're accepting of the changes that they have requested. If there needs to be a bit of narrative and discussion, we have that, and we did in this case. The Department of Finance, I mentioned them earlier, the Treasury Officer of Accounts is also copied into this process, so they also have a say if they wish, and they did because of the issues around funding were fundamental to them, obviously being finance, so they wanted to speak to us around that. And then we issue another draft report, and again, you know, if need be, we have another clearance process, but normally we get to a point where we get a final report and then we publish it.
How does that work for you? I mean, obviously, I presume then there's things that are maybe said in the first thing that maybe get watered down or whittled out. Would that be a fair assessment, or is that? In
some cases, but not so much in this one. Okay. It didn't fundamentally change, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, I should say it's CNAG's report, so it's up to her to decide what goes into the report.
Okay, thank you. Cahill?
Thanks, Chair. Long time no see. You are very welcome. Thanks. Just a couple of points. I see here benchmarking. I mean, maybe you may not be able to answer this question, but I mean, given the problems and challenges that England and Wales have, I mean, do we need to look across any other regions to see where we should benchmark there? Because I mean, I see that, you know, the Chair asked about efficiencies earlier on, so there's no point in saying we need to look at best practice models in terms of. So is there any way we need to look across when we are benchmarking as a benchmark across some other regions to get maybe a more reasonable assessment, given the reports we're hearing about what's going to. Another one there, and Michael, you said it yourself in terms of PC21 was an ambitious programme, you know, and you don't have to answer this, you don't want it, because I mean, you know, it's been going on from 2007. All of a sudden we have a PC21 programme. Now all of a sudden we're pumping money into wastewater infrastructure. It may have been the case that they had been doing it for the last number of PCs, but it seems to me that was a big target area. Do you think it was maybe too ambitious? I'm not saying it wasn't needed. That's not the question I'm asking. Was it? If you can answer it, if not, don't. I'll put it a different way. Then the question is, what can we learn then going forward to the PC27? Maybe that's a different way of putting it. Yeah.
I think the comparison between PC21 and PC15 is interesting, and I don't think there is a right answer, to be honest. I think both approaches have their issues, and any stakeholder could poke holes in either. What happened in PC15 is essentially a realistic funding envelope is assessed before you do the plan, and then you create your plan of outputs that you have a high confidence can be realistically delivered, but there's a huge gap between that what is in that list and what's needed. PC15 comes at the other end. PC21, apologies. So it doesn't set that funding envelope up front. It creates the impression of a more realistic assessment of what's truly needed, but you don't have the cost envelopes, so you're going to run into this. And I think through our fieldwork, that was an issue we were considering, which is one more deficient than the other, and that's very different. There's no objective answer. It is a very subjective assessment, so that would hopefully respond to your second.
Yeah.
In terms of the benchmark issue, then I do agree. I think it's even wider than looking at water and sewage services across other nations, and we talked about Highways Agency, but if we're looking at particularly at funding and governance, we should look at funding and governance across, different organisations and different and potentially outside of the UK, and seeing what really works best and most effectively.
Appreciate it. And that's what I'm saying, if we're going to learn anything from the report.
Yeah.
And that's just one final question in terms of, because they sign off on it, the utility regulator, is there any other challenge or any other ways we can work, or is it just that specific role? Because the utility regulator signed off on 2.1 or 2.5, whatever. After it was 2.1 originally, 2.5 after review. Is there anything we can learn from that? Because clearly, it's between whatever they requested, whatever he signs off on, then we're taking for granted that's it. And he believes in this case that they could have attained that if they had got them, because they sign off on it. Somebody somewhere realistically has to look after the consumer, which is their role. So those questions have to be asked.
I think the regulator does play a really important role in this, and we understand and we did speak to the utility regulator during the report, obviously, and the challenge NI Water, in terms of the projects that are put forward, and there is that element of challenge is really important to realistically prioritise, as well as we said to the Deputy Chair, prioritising what projects, and we understand it's continual backwards and forwards with them, particularly where finances are stretched. So I do believe the regulators has a really important role. There isn't any other option on the table at the minute, and it seems to be similar to across the water.
No, and not even questionable. It's just that they've signed off on a programme here. Realistically, it turned out it's not. It won't be achievable.
Yeah,
that's all I'm saying. But
funding,
yeah, thank you, thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, folks, for your presentation. I suppose it was just a couple of points, really. The report was completed over a year ago, and I'm keen to establish from yourselves, do you feel listened to? I suppose obviously there's a lot of recommendations in there, and it was touched upon about the level of engagement since that. I suppose I'm trying to establish, is that normal practice? I know you had a bit of an update from the department, and I suppose I'm trying to tease out, was that in advance of coming to this meeting, or is that normal practice where there is regular follow-up? Because there's no point doing all these reports and then them going on a shelf,
right, yeah.
And not being listened to and action taken ultimately by each department.
Yeah, well, we have during COVID, whenever the committees weren't, during the executive being down, we introduced this system where our recommendations within our reports, the department had to respond to those. We've kept that in. That's the same process now that is current. So we asked the department for an update as to where the recommendations we've made and what they've done about those, and whether they've implemented them. We also have the Department of Finance and the Controller and Auditor General have agreed that in future all recommendations coming from our reports are examined by the department's audit committees as well. So that's part of to monitor to see if they have implemented those. I suppose the other thing really overarching is the role of the Public Accounts Committee. All our reports go firstly to the Public Accounts Committee, and they have the obviously the primacy to hold evidence sessions on those, so they go into them in much more detail, and they produce their own report, which obviously then has recommendations within those in that report. So there are mechanisms for ensuring that these don't get left on the shelf. I think that's what you're really saying. We do the report and everybody forgets about it.
Yeah.
I'd say on this report, just if I could make the comment, this report has been extensively signposted by your colleagues in the executive and the assembly, and also has been raised through the media and whatever. So there has been quite a lot of emphasis on this particular subject and our report, which I'm pleased about.
Yeah, no, and I think just a lot of talk has been made around this comprehensive review point, and I think it's so fundamental, and we've seen the issue become greater as time has went on. So I suppose it's just to make sure that, that it is worthwhile what you're doing, and ultimately action taken. But just finally, do you feel the department has got your ear enough on this issue, and do you feel, I suppose, they are, prepared to take action ultimately to address some of these key points that you've made?
Well, I suppose if there was a review, I mean, that would be the ultimate thing coming from this report, and that's, as I said, the minister is within the minister's remit. But certainly, we had really good engagement with department and NI Water on this report. So I don't feel as though it has been put to bed and nobody's looking at it.
Was that engagement was during the report, wasn't it?
Yes.
But in the last 13 months, do you feel that engagement has been adequate?
Not in the specific area. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I don't have anybody else on my list. I see Nicola there. Just has her hand up there.
Sorry, Chair, thank you. And I just have a quick question. Thank you, Colette and Michael, for your briefing there. Just following on from the last line of question from Stephen, and I know Deborah had raised this as well, but so the suggestion from yourselves was for the department to carry out a review into funding and governance in NI Water. Would you agree that the announcement from Liz Kimmins last week, the Infrastructure Minister, of introducing a forensic audit into NI Water spending is like a good first step essentially into this here review? And we don't want to go into the details of actually what that will entail, and you haven't got all the information around that, but do you think it is a welcome first step at least into this type of review?
Well, it's slightly different issue, to be honest, because this is about the infrastructure, this report, and to be honest, I don't really know the detail of the as you say, the forensic examination. I suppose we always welcome any oversight of and enhanced oversight of any NDPBs in our role, and it's important that there is that suppose professional challenge between organisations that are overseeing NDPBs in particular. So, but to be honest, I couldn't really comment on the forensic examination.
No, that's fair enough. I know you've kind of already said that, but I suppose in my opinion, I do think it is a good first step in that regard to show that they are taking it seriously and they know there's work to be done on it, including the other three-pronged approach that John O'Dowd, as former Infrastructure Minister, had initially launched and that Liz is now carrying through. But listen, I appreciate that, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the Audit Office for coming in with this report. Cathal had raised there the need to look at other regions and other models. I think it's the case that the water's always bluer on the other side, but it's why this expert-led review that you have recommended is essential to see what works well where and at what cost. We can't just do nothing in this issue. We're not even trading water. We're sinking at this stage, and we'll be sinking more rapidly without action. Now, over the period of your review, there's been a significant increase in customer income. So that's all from charges to businesses, is it?
Yes, that's right, yes. Non-domestic charges, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's just worth reflecting that when businesses have to pay more, they end up charging more. Yeah. So that is ultimately passed on to the public as well. And in the same period, there was an increase in the customer subsidy of around 20%. That's just a rough mental calculation. But it's probably actually closer to 30. But do you know how that compares to an increase in the domestic rates accumulated over the same period?
We didn't do that analysis, Mark, to look at that. I know what you're saying, yeah, that whether or not, but then I suppose the rates, you're talking about the rates process. So the rates process obviously is a combination of a number of different aspects of funding. So it might be difficult to break that down in some way, but we didn't try to do that.
No, it was just to try and ascertain that people are ultimately paying more for water year on year, and be keen to see, and that it's work for us. I'm just trying to see if you can save me having to do it. Do you know what the increase had been, I suppose, and what was apportioned from the block grant to Northern Ireland Water in that time? But no, thank you for the piece of work that you've done. I think it would be shameful if this is to be shelved, like so much of the work that you do. And I said before, we just can't afford to do nothing on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Luke, thank you very much for your time today, and I do want to put on record, I know it's been said by other members here, but on behalf of the committee, thank you for the work that you did do in relation to the report, which is very informative and very useful for us as members. And as you referenced yourself, it has been talked about in the Assembly Chamber, and it did get quite a bit of media coverage as well, and it is something that we can refer back to as well. And say in the context of the Fiscal Council and their report, it'll be really interesting to see what things they are drawing out as well from their analysis of NI water funding as well. So look, thank you very much for your time today. We really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, members, was there any comments anybody wanted to make at this stage before we move on?
Really informative. Just
Yeah, it was a very good session. And as I say, it'll be good once the Fiscal Council comes as well to the committee.
Is that scheduled?
We haven't an exact date at this moment in time, but it will be after their report. They did give an indicative sort of time that their report will be the end of May.
Yeah, but potentially the end of before the summer is what the hope is. So the hope would be to try and
session.
Well, that's a hope. Yeah. Okay, members, we're now going to move on to item 9, which is Reyes. Hello, Des. It's good to see you again.
Afternoon, sure, thank you.
Des is up today on decarbonising transport and the policy approaches of UK regions and the Republic of Ireland. So obviously you'll see, members, at page 313 we have the Reyes briefing paper, and Des has very kindly provided, I think Des has a PowerPoint presentation.
Sure, if you don't mind, I should have realised, but my new laptop doesn't have a HDMI port. But if you're happy enough to work off the printed presentation slides, then I can just run through it from here. Very sorry about that.
Oh, no problem.
Nicola and Mark, just you're online, we will send you a copy of Des' presentation now, so that you have that to go through as well. No problem, Des, these things happen, but we have the hard copy, so thank you very much.
And the slides really just go along with the paper anyway, and just to highlight some of the key sort of graphics in it anyway, so hopefully everybody will be able to follow.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry about that, I just can't believe. Oh, actually, do you know what? Sorry, I thought that was an adapter. But
you're all right.
It's clearly not.
Don't worry at all. Like, I'll let you take it away and take us through the presentation anyway, Des. So thank you.
Okay, so as you said, Chair, the paper provides and examines the decarbonisation policies of the UK, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish governments. Each of the legislators has agreed to reach net zero by 2050. And as part of that, they have mostly all published the transport decarbonisation plans. The contribution to emissions across the regions differs depending on the economic outputs, but overall transport is the largest greenhouse gas contributor in the UK and the second largest in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The next slide just sets out the legislation and talks about the UK Climate Change Act and the need for 5-year carbon budgets, which Northern Ireland ultimately has to contribute to. And then it sets out that the Northern Ireland Climate Change Act commits to net zero by 2050, and this also requires carbon budgets that set interim targets. So the next line just sort of sets out those targets very briefly. You can see there's a requirement for 48% reduction by 2030, 77% by 2040, and 100% obviously by 2050. So just setting the challenge in terms of what the transport decarbonisation mean. The Committee for Climate Change have already said that Northern Ireland's net zero target is going to be extremely stretching. In its own estimation, it said Northern Ireland could maybe could achieve an 83% reduction by 1990 levels by 2050. And so obviously there's a disparity there. But the Committee for Climate Change are obliged to offer advice to the Northern Ireland Executive based on their own statutory targets, which is the 2050 net zero. As you can see in the next slide, it's just a diagram showing the different sectors and how they and the emissions they contribute. Obviously, transport is second, and agriculture is the top emitting sector. And as you can see on the right-hand side, these are the only two sectors that have grown since the 1990 baseline. So again, that just underlines the challenge that is faced in decarbonising transport going forward. The Committee for Climate Change have recently published the fourth carbon budget for Northern Ireland, and this provides a pathway to net zero. And I suppose any transport decarbonisation plan produced by the department is going to have to take account of this pathway going forward. The pathway is, as maybe you might expect, it's going to require a significant uptake of electric vehicles. The Committee for Climate Change suggests 78% of cars and 77% of vans will be electric by 2040. A transition to zero-emission HGVs, significant modal shift, and improvements in conventional vehicles that are already on the roads. In order to achieve these targets, the Committee for Climate Change have emphasised the need for massive investment moving forward in all of these key areas. So looking at some of the key challenges, these targets are not going to be easily achieved. Obviously, it's fine to say massive modal shifts required, but over 20 years, sustainable transport policy in Northern Ireland, modal shift hasn't been achieved to any great degree. Northern Ireland remains a highly car-dependent society, and looking at public transport, passenger numbers have really failed to recover from the pandemic, and although the most recent figures suggest that is beginning to tip, it remains to see how this bears out in the long run. Similarly, BEV uptake here, battery electric vehicle uptake, lags behind the UK, with only 2% of the car fleet currently fully electric, and there are obviously a lot of issues still around cost of vehicles, which is with parity going to be achieved soon, according to the literature anyway. Uncertainty around the technology, and of course then the issue of access to charging places in our public charging infrastructure in Northern Ireland, which lags way behind the rest of the UK, as you can see in the map on that slide 7, I believe. So just moving on now to look at some of the policy approaches around that I've observed in the different plans. It goes into a lot more detail in the paper, but I'm just going to provide a brief overview of it here. Obviously, there are similarities across all the jurisdictions, apart from really from the sort of detail on specific interventions and the funding allocations. The sustainable travel hierarchy, that you can see in the slide, provides the basis for all the transport policies across the region. It's really based around reducing the number of trips when trips are made using sustainable modes, and when car trips are totally essential, then it'll be done in they'll be electric vehicles. There are some specific plans across the regions. For example, Scotland and Wales have a plan to reduce car travel by 10%, and Ireland has a plan to reduce car travel by 20% by 2035. There are also specific targets on increasing modal share, or increasing modal shift, and increasing the uptake of battery electric vehicles, which the paper goes into in a wee bit more detail than I am here. One of the key policy areas in all the regions is looking at demand management policies. Really, these are potentially very difficult and unpopular policies that might need to be implemented to reduce car usage. Demand management plans are being prepared by the Welsh, Scottish, and Irish governments. These will look at interventions such as congestion charges, road user charges, car parking, increased car parking charges, or workplace car parking levies, type of things that'll basically make people think twice, I guess, if whether or not they should take a car or whether they should use alternative modes. There are positives with demand management measures. Obviously, they can achieve, encourage people to shift modes. They can also generate revenue for authorities, transport authorities. That can be ring fenced, used in other transport investment. But these type of policies only really work when there are really good alternatives. You can't make it harder to drive, but then not offer viable alternatives such as a strong public transport system and active travel routes as well. Already the Department for Infrastructure's planning for the future transport time for change did hint towards that demand management practices or demand management strategies would be employed, but it didn't go into any detail to what extent these would be looked at. So just to sum up, really, the blueprint for any future transport decarbonisation plan is there: reduce the trips, shift to public transport, and if you must drive, use an e-car. That's universal across all transport planning authorities, as they aim to achieve net zero. But what the plan needs to set out is how will the DFA reduce travel while supporting economic growth. Normally these two things go in together. The more the economy grows, the more people want to travel, but it's obviously something they're looking to limit. How will the DFA deliver modal shift? They've made little progress in this regard in the last 20 years, so how we're going to see this massive jump in the next 20 years? And how much is this going to cost, and ultimately who's going to pay? We need to really understand, will transport demand management policies be employed, and what will these look like? Will there be like a congestion zone in Belfast, road user charges for the wider population, a universal increase in parking charges across the region? Just some of the options, but will all need to be considered by the committee going forward. And that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Des. As always, a very informative research paper, and thank you for that, because it is something that's obviously on everybody's mind. I just wanted to check, you see, in terms of domestic transport, and then if anybody wants to indicate if they've any questions, but you see domestic transport, what does that actually mean? Is that's your car, your bus, that's everything, is it? It's just transportation, is it? Is that what that means?
Yeah, it's just land-based transport in Northern Ireland context. So we aviation and shipping emissions don't count towards Northern Ireland's overall targets, whereas in GB they would. Okay. So basically the transport emissions are based on land-based, rail and road.
Okay. And you said there port. Sorry, did I pick that up wrong? Did you say it's calculated in? And
no, it's not calculated in the Northern Ireland emissions, where it would be in Wales, Scotland, and England. And
is there a reason why it's not? Do you know why it's not here?
I don't know the exact reason. I think it has to. I do know like I suppose aviation and shipping are reserved matters, but then it will have to figure in the final emissions in the UK carbon budget, but it hasn't been factored into the Northern Ireland carbon budgets. I don't know. I'll have to maybe get clarity on that there and get back to you if that's okay, Chair.
No, that's okay. In terms of, I just wanted to check because I couldn't remember whenever I'd read through the report myself, but in terms of the likes of those demand management policies, and for example the plans in the likes of Wales and Scotland to reduce the car miles. Has that had a significant impact around the carbon reduction and meeting, you know, some of their net zero targets? Is those measures actually having a correlative impact, if that makes sense?
I think it's really too early to tell. The policies are quite recent, and they're only really starting to bring in the supporting measures to make those policies a reality. There has been a review of the Scottish 10% target by the Audit Scotland, and they've been quite critical of the fact that Scottish government hasn't brought forward the necessary plans and policies to achieve what they are. They've questioned, are the Scottish government actually really truly committed to achieving the 10% reduction, and they want them to sort of come forward and, you know, reconfirm that commitment. But at the minute, no, there's not any real measurable indicator of how successful those policies are at the minute.
Yeah, and I suppose, you know, something that you're hearing, and it's interesting because, you know, it was saying, you know, that the targets are going to be, the Climate Change Committee has said, you know, that Northern Ireland's legal target is going to be extremely stretching. And I suppose maybe that's something that's come out from other jurisdictions as well, is that, you know, the targets and actually getting, I suppose, the infrastructure to support that, getting the plans in place to support all of that is something that is actually key when you're setting the targets. It's good to have the basis of how you're going to actually do that first. Yeah, well, I suppose the UK government first came out with the 2050 target, and then the Committee for Climate Change did an analysis of each region and looked at what their equitable share would need to be in order for the UK to reach that target. And obviously they suggested that Northern Ireland would need to reduce by 83% to enable the UK to achieve its target. And they did similar analysis for Wales and Scotland, and advised on that basis. But each region has come up with their own targets, and you know, obviously Scotland and Northern Ireland 2050, Wales and Northern Ireland 2050. Scotland's actually set their limit bit to 2045, and the Committee for Climate Change has questioned, you know, how viable are these? And in every case, it says, you know, they're extremely stretching, and again, I go back to the point that it's because it's so early in the process, it's really hard to say how that it will succeed or it won't succeed. But what it will require is a very strong policy support, you know, a very strong backing from government. It's going to be expensive, and it's going to require it's a very time constrained objective. So, you know, that it's going to require a lot of work, and it remains to be seen over I suppose we'll see it more over the end of each climate or each carbon budget period, whether or not these targets have been achieved, and it'll give us a better idea moving forward, you know, the closer we get to the 2050 target, how realistic the ambition is. Yeah. But at the minute, it's really too early to say, you know, how quickly they were getting there or whether or not we will get there. Hey, Cahill,
thanks, Chair, and yes, thanks very much for the paper. Just a couple points. See that 18% domestic. We don't know exactly what percentage would be of public transport.
Oh well, I suppose
4 or 5% would.
I think I haven't got it written down here, but yeah, in terms of emissions, I mean the vast majority of the emissions are from cars. It's about 70% from cars, and the remainder would be from a large share of that. Then would be from freight travel, and then, you know, vans and HGV, and then public transport would probably be a much.
And that would be our target as a committee. So I'm just trying to break down the figures, because
I think that chart is in the actual paper.
It's grand, even for conversation, but I appreciate it. It's just as a challenge yourself, because I mean it's up 7% in 35 years. But for us as a committee looking at that, I mean, I think it's 40,000 cars travel down the motorway nearly every day. You know, there could be less, but it's between 30 or 40,000, right? So this whole challenge about rural transport, or people having we've never ever broke down where that's workers, visitors. Did we ever break those figures down? Because when we know what we have to target, if it's people coming into work in Belfast, at least there's a public transport network, say, out Armagh, you can facilitate that. You know, if we're serious about it, you know, you can talk about electric cars and all of those things, but I mean, let's go back if we want to use public transport from a committee point of view. Is there any way we can break all that down? We get a better sense, because if it's somebody visiting, you may not be able to stop somebody who wants to come shopping in the city. But if we knew 20,000 people out of 40 is travelling as workers into the city, we can encourage them to do park and ride. We can encourage them to use we can encourage them to use the trains. You know what I mean? So if we're serious about that, but the only other alternative is electric cars. I live in a rural area. I mean, most of us who live in a rural area, we need a car. There's no point in saying that.
Yeah.
So if we're really serious about it, you know, electric cars, in 10 years' time, they'll be talking about these. The batteries and electric cars are not. There'll be a problem with them next. So for now, that's all I'm saying. I'm just trying to get the conversation of what we can honestly achieve ourselves, because that's where we need a target.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, there are...
Scottish model you were saying there, pay as you drive. Now, I know it's only a report and they haven't done it, or these schemes encourage £15 per day travelling into the cities and that.
Yeah.
That's a reasonable suggestion, you know what I mean?
Yeah, for the sort of the congestion charge.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I know the Irish government are currently doing research considering, you know, what the equitable, you know, how to make those kind of policies more equitable. You know, obviously taking into consideration that there are going to be a number of people who have to have a car, like you said, driving from rural areas. But certainly there is a large amount of data that exists to tell us exactly, you know, how many people are coming into the city every day for work. You know, we've got the census data that has travel to work data. We know how far people, you know, things like the travel survey talk about how people define how far people travel to go to work, how to travel to go to places for education. I mean, there was a lot of work done as part of the transport plan process. It's still ongoing, I suppose, looking at the sort of mobility patterns around each of the transport plan regions, you know, Belfast and the wider, you know.
We looked at hubs and different things to try and address these.
There's a lot of all that analysis has been done and is out there, and certainly if there was any, you know, kind of research that the committee wanted to request from myself, I'd be able to bring some of that together.
It's a piece of work, because the only thing when you spring this to mind, I mean, there's so many people working from home now. There's encouragement, especially people who work in the public sector. As a government department, we should be saying, right, you know, work 4 days from home. Don't use the car, you mean, or whatever the case may be. But if we want to do a proper bit of research and look into it, I don't know we can do an inquiry into that, or not, or just have a look into it research wise, because that's our big target for us. That 18% is ours. It's not.
Well, I was even just thinking in checking up with the department in the first instance. I mean, in their planning for future of transport and time for change, as you said, Des, and in the report, it talks about the fact that they've hinted at demand management policies. So maybe we should check to see if the department have any demand management policies that they have in mind, because it's not something that has actually come up at committee or anything. So it might be something maybe that we could check in to see have they actually done any background work, or if they have, what, if any, demand management policies that they may have in their mind, potentially.
No, 100%.
Sorry.
Oh, look, one ahead.
I said, Jared, there are obviously, I suppose there's transport demand management can be broken down into sort of push and pull, you know, so these push policies where you talk about trying to push people out of their car, but obviously pull policies that make walking, cycling, public transport more attractive.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's transport demand management isn't all about the sort of trying to generate revenue and charge people. There are, you know, positive policies. So, as I said, the department mentioned that in the Time for Change document, but when I say mentioned, it literally was a sentence, and so yeah, it remains to be seen. Are they thinking about? I don't know. That's why I sort of highlighted it, just that it might be something that you would expect to see in the transport decarbonisation plan. To what extent they are going to go down that avenue, and you know what type of policies they're going to implement.
And I suppose for us is how much is push and how much is pull. Do you know what
I mean?
and
I think because it's work from home, it's car share, it's park and ride, it's these demand policies, whatever is charge, whatever. I'm not saying to charge everybody to come into the city. All I'm saying is, if we look to that, but to break that 18% down, we could do that with stats and figures, Chair. But
I mean, if you looking at just basing it purely on the literature and the research that I've done, if you look at any region that has successfully achieved modal shift, the only way to do it is through a combination of push and pull. You know, you have to have the policies that discourage car use alongside policies that, you know, make it easier for people to access sustainable transport as well. That's what you won't find research that I think that would argue with that.
We do have we are getting an update on the transport strategy after the Easter recess with the department. But it might be useful to have that information before they're up at the committee as well, because obviously we'll be looking more at how, you know, we are encouraging that decarbonisation.
Push and pull, that's new terminology now, Chair. First we can use it the next time. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't see Keith. Were you looking at?
Thanks, Chair. Just to follow up on thanks, Des, for that information. It's good. Respect to the domestic. Because the domestic transport terminology. So if you look on your paper under page 21, there's a little circle with share of greenhouse gas emissions by mode in Scotland. There's obviously a shipping and planes and that. Were they fit to use that and we are not?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I actually responded to the chair on that point. I'm going to have to clarify why it's used in GB. So England, Scotland, and Wales as part of their carbon budgets factor in aviation and shipping. So
shipping and planes here can't be taken into account.
I suppose there might be that one of the reasons might be that we have such low levels of domestic air travel. I don't know if you can get a flight from Belfast to Derry, Londonderry. I'm not sure what.
It'd be good to understand. I'm not putting in the spot nowadays to understand. I don't know if that's a plane, a private jet, or a plane load of plebs going on their one year holidays.
That's cheeky.
That's coming out of Jan on a Friday night.
And I'm being a pleb as well. So the point is, you know, it's just I appreciate I'm not putting you on the spot now, but good to understand how that's worked out. Days. So you know, if a plane leaving Glasgow going as X, how do they calculate that? You know what I mean? And like, think of all the transatlantic going over the top of us. How do they calculate it? You know,
as I said, I have already written down to seek clarification on that, and I will come back to the.
No, shipping and air travel is not a big thing in Northern Ireland broadly, but
the only thing that I could think of off the top of my head is that Scotland has a lot of internal flights, obviously from the major cities to the islands and stuff like that. You know, much smaller planes.
The shipping's 20%. It's a fair big chunk.
Yeah,
you know, the shipping is now. You know. But I'm not putting you on the spot with figures, but it's interesting to understand how that plane and boat thing works, you know, based on here. Yeah. That's okay.
Yeah.
Clarify that.
No, it's a fair point, you know, because there's planes and stuff that go over us, and how do you control that? But
you can do something about cars, but it's difficult to, you know, take people out of the sky. It's a difficult one.
Yeah. Des, if you could clarify some of those wee points for us, if that's okay, just to let us know, that would be perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. I do recall reading about it in whenever they mentioned that you know the Northern Ireland doesn't count it where there are other regions do, but I wouldn't want to sit here and try and pretend like a bluff and answer.
Somebody's taken those plane flights to use it. It's still at a zero broadly, but somebody's using that.
Ultimately, that data will have to be accounted, or have to be accounted for in the overall UK net zero target, but it isn't currently accounted for in Northern Ireland's net zero target. That's the situation. I'm just not 100% sure on why it is, but I will clarify that.
Super. I think that's everybody. Thank you, Des. Thanks. We do appreciate it, and it helps inform ourselves as well.
No problem.
So thank you for your time today. We really do appreciate it.
Okay, thanks. And just because I'm actually currently writing a paper on demand management measures. You know, looking at the social and looking at the social impacts of it as well. So if there's any questions that any members have on it, you know. Before I finish the paper, I suppose, if you want to go through the chair or go through the clerk's
Super.
And forward them on to me, I can.
Well, that'll be good, because if we get some more detail from the department on what they may or may not be considering around demand management policies, you know, potentially that's something that we can feed in as well, and it'd been useful actually to see that report as well, you know, because demand management policies will probably come more to the fore, I would say, in some of this, so that would be great. Thank you, Des.
Okay, no problem.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, members, we've a few more things to get through, so if you don't mind, I'm just going to rattle through, if that's okay. You're content that we do write to the department just to check up on the demand management policies? Great, yeah, thank you. Okay, item 10 is SR 2025-49. It's Plan and Fees Amendment Regulations, Northern Ireland 2025. So from pages 345 to 354, documents in relation to the statutory rule you'll see there. At page 355, you'll see the Examiner's Statutory Rules 35th report. The rule is subject to negative resolutions, so I just want to inform members that the purpose of the rule is to amend the Planning Fees Regulation Northern Ireland 2015, which prescribes the fee payable in respect of applications made under the Planning Act Northern Ireland 2011. The general effect of the regulations will be to increase fees by approximately 2.1%. The rule was made on the 11th of March, came into operation on the 1st of April 2025. So just want to inform members that the committee considered the proposal for the statutory rule at its meeting on the 5th of March 2024 and was content. The Examiner of Statutory Rules has reported on the rule and has no comment to make. Are members content with the statutory rule? Okay, thank you. So the motion is that the Committee for Infrastructure has considered SR 2025-49, the Plan and Fees Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2025, and has no objection to the rule. Okay, item 11 is subordinate legislation. SR is not subject to assembly procedure, so I advise members that there is one statutory rule that is not subject to assembly proceedings and is not required to be laid. This is at page 368 of the meeting pack, and is SR 2025-65, the Road Races Circuit of Ireland Rally Order, Northern Ireland 2025. I remind members that the committee noted the proposal for the statutory rule at its meeting on the 26th of March 2025. So are members content to note the statutory rule?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Item 12 is subordinate legislation. SL1 is not subject to assembly procedure. I advise members that there is one proposal for such a rule that is not subject to assembly proceedings and is not required to be laid. This can be found at page 378 of the meeting pack and is the SL1, the Road Races Spa Mount Hill Climb Order, Northern Ireland 2025. Have any members any issues that they want to raise in the proposal? No? Okay, so are members content with the proposal for the statutory rule? Content?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Item 13 is the Forward Work Programme. At page 381, you'll see the draft Forward Work Programme. So I'm just seeking agreement that we proceed with the evidence sessions as set out in the draft Forward Work Programme and to reflect any decisions taken today.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Item 14 is any other business, so I just want to ask, has any members has any other items of business that they want to raise? No? Okay. So item 15 is date, time and location of the next meeting. The next meeting will take place at 10 a.m. on Wednesday the 9th of April 2025 in room 29 here in Parliament Building. So thank you everybody. I now adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee Room 29, Sound.